POW MIA affairs. On the third day of hearings this week, the committee took testimony from families of missing American servicemen. The first witnesses at this hearing were retired Admiral James Stockdale and his wife Sybil. Admiral Stockdale was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 7.5 years. At that time, Sybil Stockdale became one of the founding members of the National League of Families of Prisoners of War in Southeast Asia. This was one of the last hearings the committee will hold before the congressional authorization for the POW MIA investigation expires at the end of this year. Here now is today's hearing.
POW MIA affairs will come to order. Admiral Stockdale, we welcome you. Mrs. Stockdale, we welcome you. Admiral, I want to ask you, obviously, as with a number of our witnesses, there is not a question in the mind of the United States Senate about your disposition to tell the truth, but since every witness here is being placed under oath, I hope you will not take it as any statement, and we would ask you to join with the others in that affair. So if I could just swear you in. Do you each and individually swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? We meet this morning for what I believe, and I think my colleagues share with me, is a particularly important and a very appropriate hearing. Most of the witnesses who will testify today, for most of them, the POW MIA issue is not just an issue. It's not what people read about in the newspapers. It's not something that they have to struggle to touch because it's a husband or a father or a brother or a son. And the testimony of POW MIA families will serve, we believe, as a reminder to all of us in this country about why this committee was created and why it's so vital that the truth about our missing Americans be established to the fullest possible extent. We've heard an awful lot of talk over the past year about the POW MIA families and what they think. I suspect we will learn over the course of this day that it just isn't possible to generalize about that. That these families are diverse in their views, that they've had widely varying experiences in their dealings with the Department of Defense and with the entire government establishment. We will hear from those who believe that the government has generally done all it could, from others who believe the government has bungled inexcusably. We'll hear from those who believe that we should make this part of our history and put it behind us, and from others who believe that there is much more to be learned. We'll hear from families who are angry because their anguish has been multiplied by unsubstantiated rumor and even false evidence that there is proof that their loved one remains alive and in captivity today. There is none among us who can attack the validity of any one of these points of view. For on this question, every POW MIA family member has fair claim to be considered an expert in the truest sense of that word. Much of the testimony that we will hear today will necessarily concern past events, whether wartime or more recent. I hope we will not limit our focus this morning to the past. A big part of this committee's job is to translate lessons learned and experiences that have been felt into recommendations for future action and into our understanding as a committee, so that we can share that understanding with the American people. What should DIA and the military services be doing differently? Are we doing what we should be doing in response to evidence or alleged evidence that Americans might still be alive? What is the best strategy for obtaining more information from Vietnam, information that we know can be forthcoming? What have we learned about the classification documents and about the balance between a family's right to privacy and the public's more general right to have access? And what steps can we take to keep POW MIA families from being exploited further? In preparing for today's hearing, I came across an article written recently by retired Colonel Harry Summers in which he talked about the POW-MIA issue in the context of witnessing the death of a fellow serviceman during the Vietnam War. Colonel Summers wrote that traumatic as it was for me, it was much worse for his family. But as events of recent weeks make clear, it could have been even more tragic. Instead of being killed instantly, he could have been missing in action. When the flag that draped his casket was folded and presented to his widow, there was a finality to the tragedy. But if his body had not been recovered, the suffering would still be going on. I think most have had the experience at one time or another of learning that something bad has happened to a loved one, but not knowing immediately, by telephone call or by visit, of how serious the illness or the injury might be. It is that stage of not knowing that has persisted for some for 20 years and more that is the most difficult one for most of us to deal with emotionally. But for many of our POW-MIA families, that stage has been inexorable, decades, and it is a form of continued suffering. The families represented here today and every POW-MIA family deserve our nation's profound thanks, respect, and sympathy. But more than that, you deserve our continued best effort to find the answers as long as there is reason to believe that more answers can be found. That process of finding answers is what this committee is all about. And I think I can speak for every member of this committee when I say that that determination will continue on an individual level and with the other standing committees of this Senate, even after this committee itself has opened the doors on this issue and has ceased to exist. I'd like to welcome our first panel particularly. As I said yesterday, Admiral, we don't have to ask the question about who you are, why you're here. We know full well the answer to both of those. And I think I can say that despite all of the cabinet secretaries and the high-ranking officials who've testified here previously, we've never been more honored than we are today. Both of you, Admiral and you, Sybil, are each in your own way true American heroes. And I know we throw those words around sometime in this process. I do not do so today, nor could this committee conceivably do so. Mrs. Stockdale, you carried the banner, and you were a stalwart and extraordinary advocate on behalf of prisoners. And Admiral, your story is remarkable. And I thought what I would do today, since we kind of cavalierly sometimes say you're a true American hero or talk abstractly about what people do, it really doesn't touch the full measure of it. So I wanted, with your permission, and maybe I'll do it without it, Admiral, for the first time in history over an Admiral, I just want to read from President Ford's citation to you for your Medal of Honor. And I think people should hear this. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, on 4 September 1969, while senior naval officer in the prisoner of war camps of North Vietnam, recognized by his captors as the leader in the prisoners of war resistance to interrogation and in the refusal to participate in propaganda exploitation, Rear Admiral, then Captain Stockdale, was singled out for interrogation and attendant torture after he was detected in a covert communications attempt. Sensing the start of another purge, and aware that his earlier efforts at self-disfiguration to dissuade his captors from exploiting him for propaganda purposes had resulted in cruel and agonizing punishment, Rear Admiral Stockdale resolved to make himself a symbol of resistance, regardless of personal sacrifice. He deliberately inflicted a near mortal wound to his person in order to convince his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate. He was subsequently discovered and revived by the North Vietnamese, who, convinced of his indomitable spirit, abated in their employment of excessive harassment and torture toward all of the prisoners of war. By his heroic action at great peril to himself, he earned the everlasting gratitude of his fellow prisoners and of his country. Rear Admiral Stockdale's valiant leadership and extraordinary courage in a hostile environment sustain and enhance the finest traditions of the United States Naval Service. So, Admiral, with great respect, we welcome you here today. Senator Smith.
Very, very difficult to follow that, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, my profound gratitude to you for your patriotism and all that you endured on behalf of your country. And it's a privilege and honor to have both of you here this morning, and we're looking forward to your testimony. And I might also say that, somewhat fitting, the committee began its hearings almost a year ago, or over a year ago, Mr. Chairman, with a panel of family members, and we are concluding our hearings essentially this week with family members, and we're glad that all of the family members are here today. And as Senator Kerry said, it's important that we hear your stories as to what you've endured over the past 15 or 20 years. But it's also important that we try to come up with some recommendation as to how we could see to it that some of the pain and suffering that you've had to go through in terms of securing information and so forth does not have to happen in the future to other families. So I think if we look at it in that regard, hopefully we can have a successful hearing and perhaps make some recommendations, strong recommendations, to see that that does not happen again. But it is appropriate that the families are here today, and I certainly look forward to all of your testimony, and certainly to yours, Admiral Stockdale. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator McCain.
I again welcome my friends, the Stockdales, and my former boss, Admiral Stockdale, and I appreciated hearing that citation again, Mr. Chairman. I had forgotten parts of it, and I appreciate the fact not only that Admiral Stockdale is here, but at the other side of the story is that Sybil Stockdale, during very difficult times, at a time when our government policy was to obscure or repress the POW issue, played a key and vital leadership role in bringing this issue before the American people, which I think directly resulted in improvement in the conditions that both Admiral Stockdale and I enjoyed. In fact, some would argue that some who were able to return alive may not have if it had not been for her activities, her heroic activities, and the people, the other wives and family members with her. So I don't think she received a award as high as her husband received, but I think he and I both agree that she amply deserves one. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate you and all the family members, including the Morrissey family who traveled here from Arizona to be with us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator McCain. Senator Grassley.
Mr. Chairman, I too want to welcome Admiral Stockdale and Mrs. Stockdale, and of course all the other family members. A person like me who's never been in the military, I wish I had some appreciation of what you went through, because I'd be a better American for that. And obviously I don't pretend to. But Americans would appreciate our system of government and our freedoms to a greater extent if they really understood the suffering. And to the families of the missing in action that are here today as well, you're the center of gravity for the concerns of this committee. Now, on the other hand, this committee was established mainly due to the frustrations of the family that have been built up over the years, even the decades, from not getting answers to your questions from your very own government. Your inability to get answers is what drove me and others of my colleagues to push to establish this committee, and I don't think this committee would have been set up if it hadn't been for the constant efforts of individuals and groups to say, can't you do more? And indeed, we have uncovered many answers, and we've clarified circumstances that were before shrouded in mystery, rumor, and charges of conspiracy. Now, on the other hand, the emotions and frustrations felt by the families of MIAs have, of course, as demonstrated yesterday, been preyed upon by an unscrupulous few who are out to make a slimy buck. In my view, there is much carelessness in assessing the validity of much information on this issue, and this is on both sides, fraudulent or otherwise, by true believers and debunkers alike. The work of the committee that we've done on the fraud issue is helpful, I believe, in injecting realism and skepticism into the process. After all, it is the truth that we're after, ugly as it might be. I believe this committee has tried to be responsive to families. After all, that is why we exist as a committee. To those of you who continue to be frustrated by insufficient answers, we will continue to be here to help you even after this committee goes out of business. Remember, the families of the MIAs have been the spirit behind keeping this issue alive for 20 years and behind what this committee has done this year. As ineffective or as effective as you might think this process has been, and I'm sure that'll vary with every individual, this is still the process by which representative government works, and the existence of this committee is that governmental process responding to you, sometimes very satisfactorily and probably other times very unsatisfactorily, but it still is our process of government responding. Whatever judgments and whatever conclusions this committee renders later this month is our collective judgment and our collective response to your anxieties, to your frustrations, and to your need and your right to know the truth. I hope this committee has been up to the task, and if not, we look forward to your continued concerns, not only today, but in the future, because if there's anything that people are entitled to, except when there might be a matter of privacy or national security, and those should be very narrowly described, the information this government has, you're entitled to have, especially after all these years.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Senator Daschle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the eloquent opening comments of our chairman, who speaks so frequently for many of us as this committee attempts to articulate our purpose and many of the positions that we've taken as we've gone through this very difficult process. Add to that the citation, and I must say there's very little else to add. I've not had the opportunity to publicly thank you, and to thank you, Sybil, for your contribution, not only during that difficult time, but in the 20 years hence. I was speaking to a 6th grade class some time ago, and a young boy stood up and asked whether we still had heroes today, like we had during the Revolutionary War and during those many glorious moments of our past. I attempted to say yes. I attempted to describe for him modern-day heroes without naming names. I only wish now I'd had the good sense to think of Admiral Stockdale, because we have heroes. He's sitting in front of us. We thank him and we honor him.
Thank you very much, Senator Daschle. Senator Reid. Okay. Let me just say for the record that we have a letter from newly sworn-in Senator Dianne Feinstein welcoming both of you as residents of her good state of California, and we will make that a part of the record, and also a letter from Senator D'Amato welcoming Pat Plumidore of Syracuse, and that will also be made part of the record. So, Admiral, without further ado, and Mrs. Stockdale, I think you're going to lead off, Mrs. Stockdale, which is what you did on this issue, so we welcome you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being invited here today. I feel it is important that before you write your report, you know some of the history of the United States government's relationship with the wives and families of American prisoners of war and missing in action.
Do you mind pulling the mic just a tiny bit closer?
Closer.
That would be helpful. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
That's great.
When Jim was shot down in September 1965 and listed as missing in action, it took the Navy 2 weeks to find out whether or not I would receive his pay. You might think this was because the Johnson administration had not anticipated such a circumstance, but such was not the case. In the spring of 1965, months before Jim was shot down, a Commander Hill from Naval Air Pacific Headquarters had given a briefing to us wives in Air Group 16 about how we should behave if our husbands were shot down and captured. And I'd like to comment here that Jan Dodge Otis, who is here today, was at that briefing in the spring of 1965. Some of the Air Group 16 wives could not be present for that briefing, and so I made notes and sent them the following information given to us by Commander Hill. The first paragraph was about method of notification, with every effort being made to do this in person, and if this was not possible, then by telegram or phone to prevent the primary next of kin hearing the news from the media. The next paragraph was about immediate recommended action by primary next of kin. Parents of the prisoner and parents-in-law of the prisoner should be notified by telephone, we were told. They should be warned not to release any information about the prisoner and not to be interviewed by the press concerning his background. We were told that next of kin should engage someone to act as her telephone operator. This person should be instructed to accept no calls from foreign cities outside the limits of the United States. No information of any kind should be released about the prisoner or his family. All such inquiries should be referred to the Public Information Officer at Air Pacific Headquarters. We were told that the standard answer to all news agencies should be, Mrs. Blank has no comment for the press at this time. The reasons for maintaining press silence are in the best interests of the prisoner. Any information other than name, rank, serial number, and age can be skillfully used in psychological warfare to coerce the prisoner to aid the communist propaganda program. Pictures of the family of the prisoner can also be used as coercion and thus be detrimental to the welfare of the prisoner. Treatment of the prisoner. We were told prisoners at present are being well treated by the Prisoners at present are being well treated, and authorities have every reason to believe that this condition will continue. If present conditions do continue, the prisoner will probably not have to undergo brutal torture. The family of the prisoner can expect that eventually the communists will announce that the prisoner has signed some paper which he would not sign under normal circumstances. The family should not comment on this announcement, as the information is probably correct. All prisoners to date have signed some paper which they would not be expected to do unless victims of psychological warfare. Any medals awarded the prisoner in his absence should be accepted by the family of the prisoner when they are offered. The family may expect to see pictures of the prisoner in various compromising roles released by the communists for propaganda purposes. Comments about such pictures only help serve the purposes of the enemy. Communication with the prisoner. We were told the family will be given an address through which they can write to the prisoner. All letters should be of a very general nature. Children or friends should not be mentioned or referred to other than in general terms. Families are warned to delete terms of endearment from their mail, as these can be used to the prisoner's detriment. No letter should be written that one would not be able to tolerate if printed on the front page of any newspaper. Mail may eventually be received from the prisoner and will probably be forwarded through the International Red Cross. These letters will also be of a very general nature and will not contain any of the usual terms of endearment used by the prisoner. Packages may be mailed to the prisoner, but there will be no assurance of delivery. My final entries say, families are strongly urged not to intercede on behalf of the prisoner without State Department approval. Independent intercessions on the part of the individual could seriously damage negotiations being conducted in behalf of the prisoner by the State Department. That concludes the information I sent about that briefing out to the families that were not there, the wives. Giving the Johnson administration and its ambassador at large in charge of prisoner of war affairs, Averell Harriman, the benefit of the doubt, some might assume that these guidelines really were engendered in the best interests of the wives. That rationale became totally invalid for me, however, when the Johnson administration learned for a fact certain that American prisoners of war were being brutally tortured, but continued to insist that we wives remain silent in order to continue our husband's so-called good treatment by the North Vietnamese. I know the government knew of the brutal torture for a fact certain because I was the conduit who delivered the message to the Johnson administration. Averell Harriman never came off his insistence that we wives must keep quiet in order to ensure the so-called good treatment of our loved ones. It was not until more than 2 years after Averell Harriman knew our men were being tortured that Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense in the newly elected Nixon administration, publicly acknowledged the gross mistreatment of our men and the violations of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. On the 19th of May, 1969, when Secretary Laird first made this public announcement, Jim Stockdale had been in prison for almost 4 years. In order for you to put your findings into context, it's important that you understand the extent to which we wives and families were lied to and patronized by our own government. The Johnson administration gave us no help whatsoever when we wanted to organize ourselves, and it was in spite of them that we were able to have 2,000 telegrams on President Nixon's desk the day after his inauguration in January 1969. No one in the Johnson administration, not McNamara, nor Rusk, nor the Bundy brothers, nor Clifford, ever seemed to realize that we wives were not so stupid as to not be able to figure out that they wanted to suppress the truth about our men's circumstances in order to keep the American public from being emotionally involved in the Vietnam War. Just as they never called up the reserves or imposed rent controls, they didn't want the truth about our men's torture to emotionally involve the American people in their stick and carrot war. I knew only too well they had started their war under false pretenses because my husband had led all of the airstrikes in the Tonkin Gulf incidents. President Johnson had even doubly endangered all of the lives of the men in the first airstrike against the North Vietnamese mainland by announcing their arrival to the enemy on the radio an hour and a half before they arrived. I don't think any of you members of this committee are too young to remember that during August of 1964, when President Johnson so doubly endangered the lives of our men, he was anxious to build up his macho image as he was being called a wimp in his run against Barry Goldwater for the presidency. If you want more background about the details of these events, I refer you to Chapter 1 of Jim's and my book, In Love and War. Even though some of us wives knew we were being fed a steady diet of lies by our government, we also knew that to publicly denounce our government while it was engaged in war would be to play into the hands of the enemy and dishonor the very men for whom we sought humane treatment. Please note that I say humane treatment and not the release of our men. As military wives, we knew very well that to come home before the end of the war, a prisoner of war had to have made a dishonorable deal with his captors. To his everlasting credit, John McCain, when offered such a deal, turned it down. Too bad our United States government couldn't have acted so honorably. Instead, they paraded and publicly honored the early returnees who had violated the code of conduct. They even paraded them in front of us wives and families at private meetings, further showing their total disdain for our knowing the difference between right and wrong. There was even a group within the government who schemed and plotted to take over our National League of Families as we worked to incorporate in the District of Columbia. By the time that incorporation took place in June 1970, the Nixon administration was cooperating with our efforts to get humane treatment for our men. Remember, Ross Perot had put the dire plight of our men on the front pages of the world press during the Christmas season of 1969. Unfortunately, after Ross's inestimable contribution, our government treated him as shabbily as it did some of the rest of us. When our National League incorporated in the District of Columbia, one of our stated goals was to achieve the fullest possible accounting of our men who were missing in action. And here you are, 27 years after that briefing for Carrier Air Group 16 wives, trying to untwist that braid of lies and deception that have indeed emotionally involved the American people and have brought shame and disgrace on our country. And I will be quick to point out, we are not alone in our history of lies and deception about prisoners of war and the missing in action. It seems to me that the one consistent thing the North Vietnamese have done for all 27 years is lie about our American prisoners and missing. I would urge you not to be too trusting about their latest assertions that now, at last, they are telling you the truth and the whole truth. When Henry Kissinger, and I want to say parenthetically here that he was one of the few men in Washington who consistently told us families the truth about what to expect. When Dr. Kissinger would spend hours answering our questions in bi-monthly meetings, he would explain over and over again how the North Vietnamese negotiate. We give and they hold, he would say. We give some more and they hold. Only when they are absolutely sure they have squeezed every drop of blood out of us that they can possibly get do they give anything. I feel certain the lesson of history here is as clear to you as it is to me. I won't take up your time moralizing about it. I only ask that for the sake of the honorable men who gave up their lives for the rest of us, you put partisan politics aside and write an honest report that will tell the truth. When President Bush recently announced shortly before the election that the Vietnamese had agreed to release thousands of photographs of dead and missing Americans, I talked to some of the wives of our missing in action friends about their reactions. In a word, they were frosted, my word for disgusted, to be used and abused once again for the sake of American partisan politics. As I feel sure you know from your mail and phone calls, some of the MIA wives see you members of this committee as possibly politically motivated in your devoted search for their loved ones. So let me close by repeating what I said above. In the name of decency, please put partisan politics aside and write an honest report that tells the truth. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Stockdale. Admiral.
Thank you, gentlemen. Senator, Mr. Chairman, I want to stick pretty closely to prisoner accountability and try to give you some kind of factual background about our circumstance. And I realize that in this prison and its satellites in the center of Hanoi, this is more like Joliet Prison than the Hogan's Hero prison camp. We had certain, keeping accountability was in many ways easier for us than certainly it is in people out in the jungle in a bunch of huts and chicken coops moving constantly and so forth. So I just want to tell you how we did it here, but not to say that everybody could do it the same way or as well. As you know, the first 6.5, well, this was primarily a prison for air crews, and until late in the war, they were all air crews. And the great majority of those in Operation Homecoming came out of this system, something very near 500 pilots and crewmen. So I'll start this way. In the matter of accountability for Americans in the prisons of North Vietnam, what appears to be chaotic...
Admiral, if I could just interrupt you, just refresh us very quickly on the date of your shoot down and the years that you were in captivity.
I was shot down on 9 September 1965, and I was released on the 12th of February 1973. In the matter of accountability for Americans in the prisons of North Vietnam, what appears to be chaotic to the outside after-the-fact investigators seem by contrast comparatively orderly to the self-governing, self-accounting body of Yanks who spent considerable time there. Self-governing, self-accounting, that's important. It had to be a team operation. We who struggled for years to maintain unity over self, keeping, memorizing, cross-checking names of all Americans physically cited or whispered to or tapped with, we had stringent requirements to get into the system. It couldn't be hearsay, it couldn't be anything. The guy had to have been seen or whispered to or had some physical contact with somebody. Found in those dungeons, all of this activity found in those dungeons, a meaning of life centered on being your brother's keeper emerged, creating a memorialized chronology of contacts and acquaintances that could someday, God willing, when papers and pencils were available, allow you to present to the world a history, in the worst case, of who was last known to be where. There were 4 very tough years, from late 65 through late 69, when many of us were in solitary most of the time, under the gun of a carrot and stick extortion and torture program, when the deepest fear in many of our hearts was to be stashed in isolation in some part of this prison or one of the satellites, where you could scream to the loud top of your lungs and nobody would understand English, to be stashed in isolation, there to expire by one means or another, leaving no audit trail with your surviving comrades that might someday reach your family as a creditable account of your last days. Morbid stuff, but real. And in the last instance, the trigger that in the strange high-mindedness of solitary existence drove many of us to be compulsive communicators, risking all, sometimes when you couldn't be sure the hall was cleared of guards, to get a position report out of who you were and what your predicament was. And we'd do that without old shaving a haircut. And our code that was initiated, that message initiated by that second nature tap code we had so luckily inherited from the reconstructed faint memories of a fellow prisoner named Smitty Harris. It was not part of the government never came up with that. This was prisoner generated from a memory from an enlisted prisoner in Korea that an Air Force captain named Smitty Harris remembered talking to him about. That was our lifeline. What started in August 1964 with the imprisonment of Ev Alvarez in cell 24 off the Heartbreak Courtyard in Wallow Prison in downtown Hanoi, he, the first American air crewman captured in North Vietnam, grew over the years to hundreds of Air Force, Navy, and Marine pilots and backseaters attuned to one another's presence only by that tap code, but kept not only in the hub of the North Vietnam prison system, this Wallow prison, but spilled over into a family of satellite prisons, some few within the city, but several in the countryside within a radius of some 60 miles from that old French prison, Ministry of Justice and its companion piece, Wallow Prison. I should know we wouldn't project, but there's a magnificent French 19th century piece of architecture here, which was the old French Ministry of Justice, and right across the street is the headquarters of the whole country's prison system, Wallow Prison, built by the French in the late 19th century. Americans were picked out, blindfolded, and handcuffed and shuttled around in jeeps during the night, totally uprooted and taken away from what had become their dearest friends, clinging to that memory list of 100 or 200 or eventually 300 or more alphabetically arranged names of those they knew to have been seen, tapped with, or whispered with in that private American Wallow universe of ours. While meantime, our underground resistance organizations coalesced, became disciplined, resolute, and effective, and then inevitably fell to purges that were dispersed and were dispersed when these organizations were compromised or became so effective that they threatened the commissars fulfilling the propaganda quotas of the general staff. Build an organization and have it torn down. Build an organization and have it torn down. That was the rhythm of our lives. The American prison population grew, the cycles continued, and familiar names kept popping up at Wallow Prison. It was all loop, and the same names kept going round and round. But it was the Sante raid of November 1970 that prompted the North Vietnamese to bring them all of these chickens out in the satellite camps, all back to Wallow Prison, where in January 1971, every American prisoner, with two exceptions, which I'll cover in a minute, where every American prisoner who had ever been cited, whispered to, tapped to by any other American over the last 6.5 years were all locked up in a ring of contiguous large cell blocks around the largest west courtyard of Wallow Prison. And it's half the prison. The prison occupies about a square block, and this is almost a half a block. And there we were. A place we immediately named Camp Unity, 342 of us. That was, the time was January 1971. Now the exceptions. At the time, the 342 shared tap tales of reunion between these big cell blocks. The master name list was actually 351 people cited in the last 6.5 years, or tapped to. Where were the other 9? 8 were a group we called the Lonely Hearts. 8 who had been part of us and shared comradeship with us, but were now known by us to be dead or dying. And there was one other, a healthy Air Force lieutenant colonel named Ted Guy, who had been taken away from Wallow, blindfolded and handcuffed in the Jeep in the night the previous spring. We knew that. We had that kind of accountability. We knew Guy was gone. Hundreds of people in there, but Guy was gone. We remembered that. Now at this point, our civilization, our Wallow American civilization, I'll call it, which every member joined by being carried, marched, or jeeped into this main gate. There were only 2 breaks in that wall, and one was a little pedestrian gate adjacent to this thing on the east wall. That's the only way you got in. By this time, this group that had come in that way was essentially 2 years from release. We had to wait for the B-52 bombers to hit Hanoi. We knew in our bones they would have to come to end it. Now let me clear up these 9. We would never see the Lonely Hearts again, but all 8 of their bodies would get home about the time we would 2 years later. And as for Ted Guy, we would see him on Operation Homecoming. He was a Laos shoot-down. We had 5 of them in our 351. In June 1970, he had been taken to a camp named Farnsworth, where we learned this later, where he joined American captives marched up from South Vietnam. Little did we 342 in our splendid isolation of that January 1971 know that a new mixture of American prisoners was being brought up to Hanoi. Not just flight crews that had been the case all those first 6.5 years, but Army and Marine troops, prisoners from South Vietnam, and a few from Laos were being moved in unbeknownst to us, only known to Guy, Ted Guy. We and these last were never mixed until Operation Homecoming was effectively underway. But by 1971, the war was in a new phase. Of course, more shot-down flight crewmen would join us in late 71 and 72, and particularly in a few over in 1973, what I call the Second Air War in Vietnam. 3 Marines, for instance, joined us, 24 Navy, and something just short of 100 Air Force, counting what with the B-52s. But the big thing with Wallow hardcore of the First Air War, the 351, was that the torture and isolation had stopped. The Vietnamese guards and officers were growing indifferent. To us, everything was downhill from there. We memorized the 125 or so shot down pilots as their names came in, but my memory of them and their numbers is nowhere as vivid as those of my 6.5-year sample, which I'm concentrating on because that's the centerpiece that went all the way. Men who went through storms of isolation and torture and lost track of nobody. 351 of them. We all came home together as we promised each other we would. But it was 9 and not 8 that came home in body bags because a Marine warrant officer, John Frederick, alive and well at our muster in January 71, died of an illness a year later. Ted Guy, of course, joined in and filled in where the number of living, and kept the number of living at 342. Nothing untoward happened to the additional 125 or so live pilots that joined us that last year. No abductions, and that group brought up the rear of homecoming, which was designed to be first in, first out. Now, I've said nothing about Americans who died after they were pulled the ejection handle and before they were captured or after they were captured and before they got to the gate of Wallow. And I expect there were many. For most of my imprisonment, I carried the name of a Navy Lieutenant Randy Ford, who one of my fellow prisoners at Wallow told me he whispered to in the darkness at a holding point near Vien on the way to prison. He said Ford was badly injured, never caught sight of him, but the way he was moaning and barely talking, and probably would not make it to prison alive. There were lots of people out there like that, I think. Ford did not, but I noticed I kept track. His remains were returned to the States. When I got back to Coronado, California as a hospital outpatient at our family home there, I got a desk over at AirPac headquarters across town and spent hours breezing through war reports. I'll always remember one dated 1969, a paragraph of which I jotted down. Quote, up until the bombing was stopped in 1968, the U.S. Navy lost 211 carrier airplanes over North Vietnam, and in them were 275 air crewmen. 48% of those crewmen were never heard of again. 9% were recovered by search and rescue operations. And 43% of them wound up in Hanoi prisons, a few dying while there. And that 43% is right on by my figures of the people that were shot down. And if Navy statistics are typical, while that 351 of us gathered in prison over a 6.5-year period, it's easy for me to believe that at least that number ejected and died before they were captured or got to jail. Now that's kind of a right statement, but I want to remind you what different conditions we had there. How many of us who were in there will ever forget the number of broken bones that came into those cell blocks? The idea of ejecting from an airplane has gotten to be in the public mind, you know, an automatic, easy to do thing, but that's when you slow it down and get your optimum speed and optimum conditions. But these guys are going out at 700 and 800 indicated and high Gs, and John McCain and I both have trouble raising one arm because of flail damage to us. And the shock of entering the stream there. I can remember one guy from the 105 pilot, now a very well-respected, totally normal guy. For a week, he couldn't remember his name. He couldn't remember he was fine. He was just completely discombobulated for what had happened to his body. And then if you get into the trees and the jungle, and you, even without broken bones, you probably get a skin cut getting down in that dank and infectious place. Doctors tell me it's easy to die in there in a week. And the civilians with their guns and their machetes. A very hyped up populace. If you'd heard the propaganda, the language, and they gave them pointless rifles and pistols so they could shoot at these airplanes going overhead, which was just a morale building thing. To know the number of people that had close shaves with these people. That day, September 9th, 1965, was one I will go to my grave with evidence of. First of all, I was gang tackled in the street with a pair of good legs, wound up with one that was permanently crippled. And then, to say nothing of this thing that was my fault for not holding on to the other wrist, And then that night, as I was lugged out and taken part of the way on a truck caravan, and then put in a little house in the moonlight somewhere south of where I had been shot down, and being guarded by two. I couldn't see any insignia. They were too tall for the average Vietnamese, but they were clearly trying to stay close to me until what turned out to be a Jeep came and picked me up and took me on my way. When the door burst open and a guy rushed in there and they manhandled him and threw him out. I was lying on the floor. I had no, they seemed to be quite agitated in their own way, but I didn't get the point until about half an hour later when Harry came in with a gun blazing, trying to get it aimed at me, and they knocked him sideways, and all I got was a flesh wound in my left ankle. Without them, I would have been dead. John McCain, once he got out of that lake, what happened? He and this is in the middle of Hanoi with a crowd. He gets his shoulder broken by a rifle butt, and the guy sticks the bayonet through his foot. I mean, there was a time there for everybody in many positions when the only savior was the army man with the police whistle or some miraculous act on somebody's part. Life and death hung in the balance. And you gotta live through it to realize that it's not impossible to believe that for every one of us that got there, there was one that didn't. I promised myself after remembering that airpack message of 48 were never heard of again, I said if I'm ever on the bridge of a ship and I'm at war in a place like Vietnam with the same kind of terrain and population problems, and somebody said, with a flash message, we got to strike over the beach, 4 planes down and 4 good shoots, I'm going to say to myself, I'll probably see 2 of those guys. That's the way I came out of that. We're conditioned to believe that everything works. And you're playing a good shoot is a 50-50 chance, by my book. In February and March 1973, I had several senior, I'm going to shift subjects and then get off the air. In February and March 1973, I and several senior prisoners visited Secretary of Defense Elliot Richardson in his office in the Pentagon. He said, "Did you leave anybody over there?" I acted as spokesman for the group and said no, and told him the story I just told you about our little group. We had no recollection. Believe me, at that time, the farthest thing from my mind was anybody being left. I thought it was impossible. I couldn't believe, it was just, and I told him how we'd counted noses. He said, "What about a second prison, a secret enclave?" First time I'd ever heard that. I said what I said with a lot more of a conviction than I can probably demonstrate now, because I was a lot closer to my memories. I told the Secretary I had spent the last part of 7 years trying to judge just what the North Vietnamese were thinking about, what they were capable of, and what they could get away with to our detriment, and thought that they had never crossed my mind that they could have some sort of a stash for special prisoners that could be kept secret from the rest of us for years. All their secret plans were handled by ordinary soldiers, and we were pretty cagey, and they almost always made one mistake that tipped the scales. But I think I'd like to just close by trying to explain that next time we have a problem involving prisoners, let's call the prisoners themselves into the adjudication process early, because a lot of people think that once you're a prisoner, you're just hogtied and inert and unconscious of what's going on. My God, I think of the months I spent in room 18 on this heartbreak court, watching the that was the central office of the prison, psyching out who was doing what, and how it worked. Over those years, and several sessions, I saw a female employee across the alley go through 2 pregnancies. That's how much time I spent staring at this mechanism at work. I saw a civilian, here's one I thought was pretty interesting. I saw a civilian, I was brought back from a little place called Alcatraz and under duress to get shaken down on the 25th of, late January 1969, and I saw civilian workers that within the next couple of days getting their first political indoctrination lecture after President Nixon had been inaugurated. The lecture room was 30 feet from my sidewalk, and I could hear the guy, "Nixon, Nixon, Nixon." And I had to smile when they came out laughing and slapping each other on the back. You know, they thought he had a secret plan to end the war or something. They thought, well, we got it knocked, boy. We got Johnson put down. In my hours with the commissar, line of duty conversations, on and on. I mean, we never were anything like friends. It was to our advantage both to maintain our aloofness, but I knew what was in his head, and probably he knew what was in my head. Can't spend several hours a week with a person for years and not pick that up. So I'm saying this on the basis of more knowledge than most people assume prisoners have. Okay, well, thank you very much, gentlemen.
Admiral, thank you very much, and Mrs. Stockdale, thank you very much. That is very riveting, powerful, and eloquent testimony. It really underscores, I think, the importance of hearing from you and from others today. There's nobody who can speak with this kind of factualness and reality, and the committee needs reality dose, which is why we're here. I think no member of the committee would object if I defer and allow the first round to go to our colleague who spent 5.5 years in prison with you, and against your 7.5 years, but I think we would all appreciate letting Senator McCain lead off the questions this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, I thank both of you for a very riveting and informative testimony that I think is going to play a very important role, I believe, in the conclusions that this committee will draw in our report. First of all, Admiral, I think you should know that if you live long enough, all things happen. I was in Hanoi, as you know, a few weeks ago with General Vesey. A couple of months ago, I was informed that Wallow Prison is going to be torn down and turned into a 5-star resort. So
I read that in the paper. I couldn't believe it.
Amazing turn of events. Maybe we can get a room there again someday. But
with irons at the bottom.
You'll pay for this one.
I'd like to run through just a few items with you, Admiral, and a couple of questions for Sybil, if I could. I know all my colleagues have a lot of questions, and we have other panels that are waiting. Admiral, as you know, and Sybil could probably comment on this, if a person was shot down and he was declared killed in action, there was immediate curtailment of government benefits to that family member. Gratuity was paid, the funeral was taken care of, war services, a lump sum payment was made, and that was the end of it, although eligibility for pensions or things might accrue over time. But what happened if they were declared missing in action is that the family member continued to receive full pay and benefits of that individual. And I believe, and I would like your comment, that this gave us, understandably, a desire in almost every case to declare someone as missing so that they would, on the remote chance or good chance, depending on what the circumstances of the shoot-down were, that family member continued to receive the pay and benefits, not to mention the guilt that we would feel, as did happen, if someone was declared killed and later turned out to be alive. I'd like your comments on that aspect of this whole situation of classification of those who were...
Well, I think and I saw that happen when we started losing. I was the CAG of the Oriskany when on the first combat cruise of it, and we started losing people. And I had a kind of a salty old captain named Bart Connolly, and we had a guy that was declared. Well, he was in an AD. Last called a Mayday, hit about 1,000 feet going in a steep dive, and of course there was, as you know, John, no ejection seat in that plane. And they went out there the next morning and they found that the Vietnamese had removed the debris, and the squadron commander said the guy he's dead. And I went up to see Captain Bart Connolly, and I said, I'm just getting started in this thing, and I sent the message, whether I should have called him KI or MIA. He said,
pull the mic a little closer.
Yeah, right.
Just
he said,
pull it closer.
He said, I did this in World War II, of course, and he said, there's a great temptation to do the wife a favor, but in the long run, I think you do her an injustice because you're giving her the wrong message. If you think he's dead, say he's dead. Now, I did that but I saw that was immediately eroded, and people that were seen to, I've been told, people that were seen to go to spin in the traffic pattern and crash in their plane were listed as MIA for that same darn reason. And so the whole, we ought to think of a better way to compensate families besides lying to them.
I agree, Admiral, and I hope that something will come out of this so that we will not basically penalize a family for their family member being killed in action. And I think that if anything comes out of this, we ought to try and somehow adjust that situation. Admiral, from your very strong statement, it indicates to me that you do not believe that we knowingly left any Americans alive in Southeast Asia at termination of that conflict. Is that your view?
I have no, I know there's some things I don't know about Laos, but I'm positive there's nothing. I never had a clue. You know, I don't think we would have come home if we thought that, if it hadn't have been for some kind of a overweening feeling of accountability among us there in Hanoi. I have no evidence of anybody that was left intentionally or alive in Laos or anywhere.
We've had witnesses, Admiral, that there was after that a conspiracy, and that's why I was interested in the part of your statement that you remained involved in this issue for some years afterwards, that there was a conspiracy and or a cover-up orchestrated by various administrations in the intervening years. Have you ever seen any evidence of that?
No.
Do you believe that it would be possible?
No, I think it'd be. I think to have it, to go into it as a venture, you'd be a fool because there's so many possibilities of leaks and so forth.
Admiral, do you believe, as some of us have grown to believe, that there was a period in the 70s that there was not sufficient attention given to the issue?
Well, I tell you, I think I was rather disappointed the way most of us kept so many mental notes in Hanoi, and so we could write them down later. And I don't believe, and I wrote them down, and I know many others did, and I don't think, I thought somebody could, I imagined myself to be obliged to bring back data that would allow some wargaming thing or something to almost reproduce the circumstances day by day back there. Who was living next to me and what when I moved. And I think maybe it was, everybody was lulled into, I was certainly not conscious that there was any living people left back for years. I didn't even hear about it. And I think that I was a little disappointed that they didn't make more of the knowledge we brought back. Now when we're trying to salvage it from these years out, we have all kinds of problems, including memories of exactly what happened. I don't, that's about all I got to say on it, John.
Thank you, Admiral. Sybil, in conversations that we've had in the past and present, the League of Families obviously became a target for people to exploit in various ways. Did you experience incidents where unscrupulous individuals approached you individually or as an organization to seek money or publicity or something like that you felt was exploitive of the League of Families?
Yes, there's one case in particular comes to my mind, and I think Charlie Havens is here today. I don't know whether he's still here or not. He was our legal attorney for the League all during the years that before the Operation Homecoming. And we were approached, I remember one time, by a gentleman, I don't remember his name now, but he had been with AID, he said, in Southeast Asia, and he was an attorney and he had offices in The Hague, and he was passing through Washington, and he said that he had very valuable information that he wanted to give to us, and so this came up kind of on the spur of the moment, and so we called together our executive committee of our board of directors of the League of Families, and this gentleman rented very prestigious law offices here in Washington And he engaged a law clerk from Georgetown, and we all met there in the law offices. And his proposal was that the Buddhists, he happened to know from his work with AID that the Buddhists were now ready to make their move. And he could guarantee that within 30 days, the Buddhists would take over the prisoner of war camps in North Vietnam. And then the Buddhists would what's that word when you're going to pay for people?
Ransom?
Yeah. The Buddhists would ransom the prisoners out, and the North Vietnamese would save face because they would no longer be involved. And he said that he could guarantee the Buddhists were going to take over these camps in 30 days. He could arrange it. And I said, how much is this going to cost? And he said he needed $25,000 to set it up, and he would give us 30 minutes to think it over because he had to catch an airplane for The Hague, where his offices were. And as I remember it, I said, you don't need to take 30 minutes because how about, since you guarantee this, 12/5 now and 12/5 in the 30 days? And he said, no, that I didn't understand how these things worked. And we turned him down as a league. But the sad part is that when I got out on the sidewalk later and we were getting ready to disband, one of the wives came up to me and said, Sybil, some of us are going to put up this money individually. Do you want to go in with us? And I said, don't do that. You're going to lose your money. And they did. He was a very, very professional con man. I didn't know that con people could be that professional. You know, I'm kind of a skeptical person, John, and I thought I could cite, you know, but there are very, very, very skillful, clever people, and I think that for years have taken tremendous advantage.
Sybil, did you I know you happened to see some of the testimony yesterday, these mailings and claims that are being made. Do you have any view not only of that procedure itself, but the impact that that has on family members? You speaking as a person, I'll be asking that question
it's just terrible. It's just terrible. I've had wives and mothers call me up in tears on the telephone because they've been whipped around by these people to such an extent that they don't know what to believe. I mean, when somebody calls you up and says, don't you love your son? Don't you love your husband? And if you will just participate in this activity, we can see that he will come home. That's a terrible thing, and I hope they're prosecuted to the fullest extent. And I couldn't be happier than to see that you're going after them.
Thank you very much, Admiral and Sybil. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the indulgence of the chairman and the vice chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator McCain. Mrs. Stockdale, first of all, let me say that with respect, speaking as a Democrat only momentarily, because we have not been partisan here, but you'll find that the comment I'll make is not partisan. I couldn't agree with you more in your perceptions of what happened in the Johnson years. It's a sad chapter. It's part of our history now. A number of books have been written articulating the secretness and the efforts to get our cake and eat it too, and wage the war and not pay for it, and a whole lot of things we did then. And I think your personal statement about it just brings home even more directly the ways in which that cost us and still does. You spoke about the responsibility of this committee with respect to the truth in our report. Would you share with us just for a moment more what you perceive that truth to be as to the question of whether people were left behind alive and whether they might be alive today?
I have to tell the truth because I'm sworn, and I have never thought that anybody was left behind.
The committee will be in order. Warning. In fact, I've already warned Mr. Sampley previously. The committee will be in order. Would you please remove Mr. Sampley from the hearing room? The committee will be in order.
Sir. Morris. Well, don't you keep that out of file? Sir. Take the vote today, Senator. Let's hear your vote on those files that you keep them locked up. I got it.
All right.
Admiral and Mrs. Stockdale, what you've just seen and what America has just seen is evidence of the raw emotion that this committee is trying to deal with and that the nation is trying to deal with. I don't harbor any ill will towards the gentleman who articulated what he said, and it's an expression of something that's out there that the committee has to deal with. And I'm kind of glad in a way that we're here talking about it now in the wake of that. You've got a whole group of people, and the committee is going to deal with this, and we're trying to deal with the truth. You're articulating what you believe, you're under oath. How do we deal with that? I mean, what is it that is so deep-rooted in people that they are convinced someone's not telling them the truth? Do you want to address that as you speak to my former question?
I can see why they are that convinced, because of the long history of the deception. And maybe a lack of recognition that there are always some people in war who are lost. There will never, in my opinion, be a satisfactory accounting. In our league's list of objectives, we said that we wanted to get the fullest possible accounting. When you lose a war, you don't get to go in and account for your people. Even if you win the war, you don't find everybody. And I couldn't be more sympathetic. I just am incredibly sympathetic with the people.
What do you make, and Admiral, I'd like to particularly ask you this, what do you make of live sighting reports, of reports that have come out over the years suggesting someone's held in captivity, and some of the evidence that has come before this committee in the course of our hearings suggesting that? You were meticulous, and I don't think you've even described fully the degree to which you were meticulous, and I hope further questions of members will pull this out. The method by which you folks tracked everybody, the memorization process, the name back us, there was an agreement. You were going to know who everybody was, where they were, and you were all coming back together. And this was deep-rooted in your survival, was it not?
It wasn't something, it was more powerful than a policy. This was no man on a white horse, me or anybody else engineered this. It was just a psychological mood that overcame us because of the threatening environment we were in, and we saw we were very fragile. We never had a moment in those first years when we didn't feel that there was no macho in that prison. I never heard a senior tough guy chew out a weak guy because he knew that he was right on the edge too.
Now, I know because of your interest in this and your inability, just in terms of experience, to ever divorce yourself from it, that you read these accounts, you've read the reports, you know of these live sighting reports and people who say somebody's left behind. What do you say to that, 1992?
Well, I have never gone through them, but I mean, there's so many incentives, it seemed to me. I guess that this has been poo-pooed, but for a while it was surely the incentive to report people was a ticket out of the Eastern Hemisphere and into the West. Am I all wet on that? I mean, it just seems like human nature to. And then there's a kind of an unreal. as we've come along in this 20th century, we've become litigious, is that the right word?
Litigious.
Litigious society, where we believe that somebody owes us an explanation and an apology and a payback if something is not quite right. And when you start talking about warriors last seen alive, never being, that the government owes you a blow-by-blow description of what happened to them to bring about either their demise or their missingness, there's never been a war in history that any government could do that. I mean, to say that the government owes us an explanation for what happened to a guy who was last seen alive out on the battlefield. I mean, can anybody see that as a possible reality? I mean, at night or, you know, in storms, people get buried under avalanches. There's any number of things that have happened over history. Now, that's just an unrealistic goal somebody has cooked up, and now it's a demand.
At one point in the prison structure, you folks got together and you did a muster, did you not? What was the muster? What did you do?
Well, I call it a muster. It was, we had a very, again, I want to talk about one particular personality. In prison, there as we lived,
Admiral, pull the mic, just slide the whole thing towards you. There you go.
Out here, when you want to describe a guy, you say, he's tall, he's handsome, he's articulate, he's smart. In there where you couldn't see him in the first place, but you'd say, I know that guy, he's got a hell of a good memory. I know that guy, he's got real good eyes. I mean, there was a whole different new classification, and the memory was very important. And this compulsive communication thing, it could be an asset, where there was one guy that topped it on both scales, and it was Howard Rutledge. He's dead now, unfortunately, of cancer since we came out. But it was he who said to me, and he'd been with me in Alcatraz, and he said, first of all, I'm going to get some of the bad names out of this system. I didn't bother to tell you that. He said, we've picked up some bad names. Names that were picked up accident. A typical case, a guy is shot down, he gets under a door, he's new at the game, and he's worried about this guy in his front seat or his back seat. He wants to know where he is, and he talks a lot about this Jones. His name is Smith, and Jones is missing. Well, anyway, somebody down the hall picks up both names, and I mean, this way, so they spent most of that weeks. They had guys there from all these camps, and they threw out 4, 6, 8 names because they were false. I mean, people, they would say, where did this come from? That's got to be this. I mean, there were judgments. These were judgments that they made. They had to make them. And this was, you know, now this would be a very, you know, squirrely thing to do, to say that's a bad name. But they had to come down to practicality. So they skinned them down, and that's where the 351 came. And there was no errors made. I know Rutledge. And then what he did, he went back, and he got lists he could remember from all these cell blocks, and he went through them name by name, 342 of them. And over a period of weeks after he talked, and he had guys working with him, tapping on the wall, and okay, I got it, I know this guy, I got him. And then he came, boss, we got 342 in here, and we've skinned the names down, and we got 9 missing, and they're
and as you said, as people were scattered and moved around.
Well, this was all that month we were there. That was providential, just God-given, that we had them locked in. They started peeling off in February.
But what I want to say is that, or what I want to ask, but in framing the question, there were people scattered all around at periods of time who then came together.
Yes.
And your process of communication required the connection of all of those places.
Right. We had
to which
this
they
history of names, and we found ourselves providentially all within tapping distance, you know, through relays. And so there was a time for house cleaning, and Rutledge masterminded that, worked a whole month on it, and he came up, it's in his debrief on page 11 if anybody wants to see it, and he gave us those numbers, which are very key.
Mm-hmm. So after all of this collection of effort from all of these various prisons, no one ever reported to you of any other prison or any secret place or hearing of anyone held anywhere else?
No, there were bad names in the system, but we had guys that, you know, that were good at, and that was by accident. Nobody planted a bad name. I mean, there would be no motive for it.
And speaking as someone who, as I evidenced in the citation that I read, I mean, you not only disfigured yourself in an effort to dissuade them from believing you could be punished, but you tried to take your own life to deter them and to send a message to them about your value system.
That's right.
Based on that concept of morality that you have been driven by and the entire process that you felt drove all of you, that you would come back together, speaking to us today, to a matter of moral certainty in your heart and under oath, do you believe that you left anybody behind or that anybody was alive?
No, no, I wouldn't have come back. I say that with maybe it would have been a practical problem with the U.S. government out there with their C-141s, but I mean, we would have let them know some way that things are not right. We wouldn't have said, well, here's the bus, get on it.
Now, you have acknowledged, however, that as to Laos, you can't be so certain.
No, I know literally nothing about Laos.
Okay.
And I want to say that in my opinion, Ross Perot has more information on Laos than anybody else, and I know for a fact that Ross Perot is an honest man. So I would advise the committee to believe him. He has I think, more information, I think, and as I said in my statement, it's too bad that the government gave him the heave-ho when he was so close to answers.
And a final question, my time is up, but coming back to this truth, I just wanted you to complete that. What is the truth that you're so concerned about the committee might shave on or that we might try to avoid? What is this core concern you have about our telling the truth? Would you just lay it out to us?
It's... I guess because of the history of lying and deceiving, I have the concern that I just want to be sure that you'll tell it like it is.
And how is it?
That you'll tell it like it is.
In your view, how is it?
It's not a very pretty picture. It would, I think that the families deserve to know what the facts are about the demise, and the facts can be very ugly. But I think that they have the fortitude and the need to know the facts. And I have such faith in them that they can handle the truth, that I want them to be given the truth. Let them, they're very, very capable people.
Do you think the government's withholding that, or do you think that is there information they still have that they're not giving them?
Well, I understand there's information they have they're not giving you, so if they're not giving it to you, I don't think they're giving it to them.
Well, we've gotten, in terms of case histories, it's my understanding that, and we're going to hear from some of them today, there are still some documents we're waiting for. But I will tell you that in terms of the, quote, smoking gun area possibilities, National Security Council minutes, critical cables in the State Department, negotiations, etc., we're certainly getting access. There are some documents we haven't seen yet. But our primary targets were, quote, the highest potential for smoking gun documents. And we're now working down to the lower potential. We haven't gotten all of them yet, but we've worked out a schedule in the next days. Well, anyway, I've used my time. Let me turn to Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say before I ask some questions that I admire both of you immensely, and if my daughter could be half the person you are, Mrs. Stockdale, I'd be very proud, and my son's the same thing for you, Admiral. In listening to what you said and reading your statement beforehand about the, using your terminology, lies and deception, misleading information that you dealt with in your early years in trying to get the help for your men who were in Vietnam in those prisons. I'm taken aback by your comments, though, that that deception may not be taking place today. And I'm not making any accusations regarding any government officials here, but you know, not telling the truth to Congress is not a strange phenomenon around here. It happens by government people all the time in all aspects of the United States government, not just this issue. But it's you mentioned Ross Perot, and I also have known Ross Perot not as long as you have, but a number of years, and find him also to be a man of the highest integrity. He testified before this committee, and he talked to me privately and other members of the committee privately, and he said that he was briefed on American POWs in Laos by high-ranking, or at least intelligence officials in Laos during the war, of quite a large number, quite a large number of American POWs in Laos that were being tracked or being watched, or in some way some information was being processed on these POWs. When he said that, and we brought witnesses who were, according to Mr. Perot's testimony, in that room with him at the time, they denied it, which goes right back to the credibility question. I believe Ross Perot. I'll say it publicly. If he said it, I believe it. Now, let me just, and I understand, Admiral, that you had no relationship in Laos in terms of your own imprisonment, and I don't mean to challenge you on any fact that you have said, but in looking at the statistics that you brought up, 43% of the Americans who were shot down over Vietnam wound up in a Hanoi prison. 1.5% of the people who were shot down in Laos came out. 9, and they came back through the Hanoi prison system. The rest did not come back. One of those who didn't come back, whose wife is here today, Carol Herdlicka, was photographed for propaganda purposes, and his pictures were circulated, Mr. Herdlicka, and he was clearly a prisoner. He never came back, and we've never heard a word about what happened to him. So somebody knows what happened to Herdlicka, and we were not told. And I guess I just want to be certain, when you say that you don't think anybody was left behind, you mean Vietnam, correct? Not necessarily Laos.
Yeah.
How do you explain that? The Vietnamese had a considerable influence over the Lao, to say the least, didn't they? The Pat That Lao were their puppets. They don't like that word, but that's the word I'll use.
Well, I guess, then again, what I have to believe from what I watch on these hearings and other things is that we had no negotiating leverage over Laos when we wanted to stop the war, and so we got a commitment out of North Vietnam to get all of our prisoners out of there. Is that right? And they couldn't deliver on it? Is that?
Well, I think based on the conversations that this committee has had with the negotiating teams of both our side and the Vietnamese side, there's pretty much common knowledge here that the Lao were simply not participants in the process. And the Vietnamese made that point a number of times to us that, hey, you have to talk to the Lao if you want to find out about the Lao prison.
Well, are they?
Well, we didn't talk to the Lao.
I don't know what to make of the Lao personality. I don't know whether they're just mean or whether they're just careless. I don't know.
Well, I understand. I guess what I'm trying to get at is you and the work that you did and that your fellow prisoners did in accounting in keeping those names in that memory bank was a tremendous
I know, and I don't think it could be a model for Laos or these. You know, I read Nick Rowe's book about the way he was down there in South Vietnam, and he was on the road half the time. Maybe he'd have one guy kicking along with him, another American for a few months. And ours was nothing like that. In many ways, ours was worse, but in many ways, theirs was worse because there was. I mean.
But you kept because of the control and the way that you all memorized those names, you had a pretty good feeling for those in the prison system that you were in. Now,
I'm sure we didn't leave anybody behind.
Right, in the prison system that you were in. But if there is another prison system, and you testified you don't know of one, but if there were another one, obviously there could be some.
Is there any other problem? But here's what I'm really curious about, because sometimes I hear people say, it's kind of a conventional saying now, there probably were some people left in Laos and maybe in Vietnam. What do you got for this maybe in Vietnam? What kind of evidence do you have for that?
I'm sorry, maybe in Vietnam?
You know, when it's loosely said that North Vietnam is considered to be a possible haven for unreleased, or possible place where we have unreleased prisoners. Who would they have been?
Well, we have a. Let me give you a couple of specific examples. As Senator Kerry's already talked about, there are numerous live sighting reports. Many of those pertain to Garwood and proved to be accurate. There are also many live sighting reports where people who have passed polygraphs. Part of the job of this committee is to try to determine the validity of those reports, but they have not been, some of those reports have not been debunked in the sense that those individuals who provided those reports to the United States intelligence officials indicated that they saw live Americans in a captive environment in Vietnam. We also have similar sources in Laos. But let me give you an example, because you mentioned the debrief of Rutledge. He had, Rutledge testified, excuse me, in his mention in his debrief, the name of a James A. Preston from Laos, name heard by several returned POWs over Voice of Vietnam or Camp Radio, and a number of POWs who returned mentioned him. I don't know if you recall the name, but no. I realize it's been a long time.
No, but I don't doubt. I mean, Rutledge heard his name over.
He never came back.
He was from Laos, wasn't he? He was not in our system. No. He was not in our
no, prisons. But his name was heard by several returned POWs over Voice of Vietnam or Camp Radio as being mentioned as a prisoner. Well, I realize it's hearsay, but
well,
again,
I realize no. I think it's very possible that they had a Laos prisoner and they got him up there, or maybe in the port, and got him to say something that was broadcast over Hanoi, Hana. That doesn't, you see, that doesn't invalidate what I said, because what I said is that guy was not in our prisons.
To your knowledge, and with all your contacts and communications with other POWs who have returned, did any POW ever report to you seeing or having seen or knowing of a POW that they had made direct contact with who did not return?
Never did that happen in 8 years or 7.5 years. Never did anybody say, we've got a guy over here, and if ever you find somebody that says, I was in a Hanoi prison and I saw a guy and then he didn't come home and I don't know what happened to him, he's not telling the truth.
Did any POW that you came back with ever indicate to you that there was any type of segregation in the camp system that you were a part of concerning military specialty? Were people segregated out because of a particular background or specialty in the military?
No, I don't know of any.
Did you ever hear of Camp Dog Patch?
Yes.
Tell me what you know about that.
Only that I think 114 or 140, quite a number of guys, that it just popped up after in the last couple of years. I first heard of it after they came back. They loaded up a bunch of people out of that Wallow prison compound, Mostly young fellows, by my, junior young fellows. I mean, guys in their mere 30s. I was damn near 50 by that time. And they went up there, and then they came back, and one guy died. That's about all I know. He died of natural causes.
I just want to conclude, yield to my colleagues, regarding something you said, Mrs. Stockdale. You said for the committee to try to get the truth and to tell it, and I respect you for saying that, and we are trying to, but let me just conclude my round by saying the difficulty for us is when you have people who are considered to be credible government witnesses say one thing, a person like Ross Perot, who's a very credible person, who says another thing, and they're totally at odds with each other. That tells you the difficulty that we face. In one case, the individual, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you. In one case, the individual who testified here denied even meeting Mr. Perot under the circumstances that he described, let alone the topic of the conversation. So
I looked at your face when you cross-examined those guys, and I agreed with you.
I understand the difficulty. I'm not minimizing the difficulty of your being able to tell the truth. I just want you to make your best effort, and I know you will.
Thank you. We certainly will. I apologize to my colleagues, but I sense a frustration in your opening statement about the debriefings, in the sense that you didn't feel they were thorough enough. Is that an accurate characterization?
Well, I guess there wasn't all that much urgency. I said, gee, why did I remember all these details when nobody put it into the jigsaw in case, But it was a very... There were some things that happened when we first came home that were not well done. One was to make a government policy that nobody would be charged with any criminal offense when they came out of prison, unless another prisoner brought the charges. That was a terrible mistake to ever have a government make such a judgment as that. Because when you bring a bunch of guys like I had, and you can see the type they are, they would not tolerate collaboration. And we had we had probably 6 people that were like this, but 2 that were prominently senior and off base. And they came out because we didn't have pencils and papers, and I had communicated through relayed ball taps with these people about their collaboration over time. And many people memorized those conversations and went over them daily so they could present them in evidence at court. That much preparation was made. I didn't ask for it, but when I came home, they came to me and they said, "Boss, you've got to bring these guys to General Court Martial." And the Navy said, "If it happens, you do it." And I did it. And I had all the help I needed. I had the Naval Investigative Service and the best JAG lawyer they could give me, but I signed the charge sheet. Now and Sybil could tell you, a year after I'm out, people say, "You're relaxing, aren't you now?" I remember one night I was in the back, in the study with 5 lawyers going over these charges. They had drafted charges of about seven of them. The first 4 were capital offenses. And Sybil said, "Oh, what is going on?" She was waiting for dinner and came out in tears. It was just, and we didn't deserve that kind of treatment, particularly when the Secretary of the Navy dropped the charges or gave him a slap on the wrist after it was all over. So that's just a sideline I want to get out. But I want to ask another question because you mentioned a fellow here that I won't mention, but are you familiar with this book, Marines and Military Law in Vietnam, Trial by Fire by Colonel Gary Solis, put out by the History and Museums Division of the Headquarters Marine Corps, 1989, forward by Eddie Simmons, Brigadier General, the Director of Marine Corps History. Are you familiar with that book?
I have not read it.
Well, you should read Chapter 10 before you believe too much the material put out by one of the witnesses you just mentioned. About half of it's about him.
I would like to say something on the subject of debriefing. I think that it would have been extremely advantageous if the primary next of kin had been debriefed at the time that the men came home. Nobody paid any attention to us. I hired a secretary and debriefed myself because I knew I'd had a rare and unusual experience and I wanted to keep track of it. I think that was a terrible mistake, just to totally ignore the primary next of kin when the men came home.
Obviously, there was a great deal of information that you had that, had you been able to get it down at the time, could have been shared with the families, and apparently that, in some cases, was done, but in other cases was not very thorough, is what I hear you saying. Thank you.
Senator Daschle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to pick up where Senator Smith left off, because I think this is a critical part of our effort to piece together what has happened and compare it to a certain extent with what's happening now. Do I understand, Mrs. Stockdale, that you have never been debriefed officially by the federal government?
You understand that correctly. Yes, never.
And Admiral Stockdale, to what extent have you been debriefed, even in subsequent years, by DIA, by anybody, as we try to put together our best information?
Nothing but my initial debrief, which was rather extensive. I have to say that they broke through this barrier that has disturbed people over time when you have to be sworn and sort of like going to trial, and a lot of people have gotten very upset about that, from the Korean War, I think, maybe World War II. So the government did a good thing in trying to not give any indication that the interviewee, the man that came out of prison, was in the dock. So they put, in my case, and I think most cases, good young intelligence officers on it. I think I sat on our back, most of the debrief came from my sitting on our back porch in Coronado with a tape recorder, with him sitting in the chair beside me, and I talking, and he occasionally asking questions. I have those tapes. It takes 52 hours to play them.
When was this?
This was in March 1973. Probably.
And have there been subsequent attempts on the part of investigators to come back and seek
No, but I
additional
don't think I would have had, I wouldn't have, I said it all there that I knew about, relevant events. But I mean, if they'd asked me about Laos, that's like asking me about, brain surgery or something. I'd have to get into it.
No, I'm not asking about Laos as much as I guess what it occurs to me from the experiences we've had thus far in the committee that the value of oral history has been underestimated throughout the process. People in positions of authority who are investigating this failing to seek out those who have a wealth of information about individuals, about circumstances surrounding a name. You've thrown out, you indicated that names were thrown out. Yeah. I mean, that very, that issue alone. Why were they
well, that would be a big deal now.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I had Rutledge on it. You've got to have men you trust. He knew the syllables and he knew the people who had them, whether he had accuracy, what his reputation was for accuracy. I mean, it's just the way you run a business, the way you run a football team. You've got to have guys that can make decisions and put the right lineup in.
I'm sorry. Nobody in 20 years came to you about a specific case.
No, I agree with you. I think...
no, I'm asking the question. Is that true?
That's right. And we've had lots of imprisonment cases in the hostages in Iran, the Desert Shield. I had lots of thoughts about both those, but nobody
Did you at any time make it known that you were available, just to remind them that you had this information, that you were really a walking library? And did you ever repeat your interest in being debriefed and specifically talking about certain cases?
No, it seems, there's a general, a different group takes over, and they don't go to the old soldiers, they go to new bureaucrats.
And also, I want to say that that a wife whose husband was shot down in Laos in June of 1965, I don't think you have talked to at all, and I think she's the most. She said to me on the telephone not long ago, "Laos I know about." Her name is May Rose Evans.
And Ms. Evans has not
Humphreys.
been contacted either. Is that what you're saying, Mrs. Stockdale?
Not to my knowledge.
And it's just another illustration of how extraordinarily inept this whole investigative process has been. To fail to talk to the chief, the commander, the person who has been in charge, who understood probably better than anybody else the names, the locations, the stories, even now, is just a tragedy. What do you? I was going to ask you what you think of the current investigation. Obviously, it's much more aggressive. It's much more comprehensive. It is. We're now doing things that we haven't done before. Well, I don't want to characterize it. You characterize it for me. How would you assess what we're doing today?
Well, I think it's, I'm having the opportunity I wish to have for years to make, get in the act and to make comments that might be helpful to the decision makers.
What are they missing?
Huh?
What are they missing? What aren't they doing that if you were running that whole show?
I think you're bogged down in a lot of bad data.
Bad data? Like what?
Like, there's no selectivity. If a guy says he saw a pink elephant in Burma, it's in the file.
And you've got to go investigate it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how.
And if I could just, if you yield for a minute without losing any time, if you don't do that, then you're accused of not caring and not following.
I know it. And I unabashedly say that you see, I could have, a lot of people would say, oh, now he says he threw out names. Well, he must have secret people that he left. Baloney. I mean, I know I've picked up bad names. I've heard people make mistakes. And you've got to know your people. You've got to know the motivation. I just looked at a paper yesterday where there was a lot of assessments made by different people, and I knew a lot of the people, and I knew their motivations, and I knew how to weigh them. I said, you know, I better, hey, that's interesting. Old Joe said this. Oh, this guy said that. I'm not surprised but here, this, you know, but you got, with just every piece of paper having an equal value to the next one, you can't run any kind of a business that way.
Well, let me, in what time I have left, address one of the most difficult issues having to do with data and pieces of paper, and that is the status that we accord each one of these cases that are still outstanding, 2,264 cases. The current operating procedure, of course, is that remains must be returned in order for the case to be closed. Do you subscribe to that stringent a definition in terms of case resolution, or would you give us any guidance as we make our recommendations as to how we resolve a case? Some that we know were cases involving explosions over water, a lot of circumstances that you say, you made a point earlier that I...
Yeah, I said that, it was inevitable in war that you would irretrievably lose people.
The comments you made earlier, and I think it was Mrs. Stockdale, if you think he's dead, say he's dead. Are we failing to do that? And if so, what guidance would you give us with regard to the question of remains today?
Well, I don't know
Well,
somehow we lost the, you know, when I was calling the shots, I mean, somehow there's been a loss of momentum, and so whoever pops up, he gets his head blown off if he does anything that doesn't, fairness is the whole story anymore. And
But you said when you first came home that one of the things the Vietnamese did was keep meticulous records about everything.
In my debrief, there's a lot.
And I think they've got tons of stuff they haven't given us.
Yeah, they were just kind of the bureaucratic. The group we were dealing with were the second-generation communists, the bureaucratic elite, and they were inveterate note takers, and they would have pockets full, and you'd say, wow, and then so something came up on television about, yeah, they got records of that, and they got records. I mean, they wrote everything down.
But I just, if I can,
I don't know where they filed it.
either one of you, because you're such good authorities on all of this information, could really help us. Let's assume they do have a lot of information they haven't given us. Whenever it is that we get it all back, how would we treat those cases for which remains have still not been provided?
I think there has to come a point in time when you feel absolutely certain you have everything you're going to get. And I think that point in time can come. I don't think we're as close to it as some might like to believe. But I think that there will come a point in time when you have to take the responsibility to make the judgment that some people are nothing is ever going to be returned. And that's your job.
Is that part of what you said when you were talking about the truth?
Yes?
Admiral Stockdale, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, no, I think Sybil's right. I think she says it well.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you very much, Senator Daschle. Senator Grassley was next in line ahead of Senator Daschle, but he wasn't here, so I'll go back to Senator Grassley.
Just a comment from my perspective, just as another point of view on what Mrs. Stockdale just said. I see my job as a member of Congress in an oversight committee to make sure that people that are assigned under our Constitution to carry out certain responsibilities, in this case the Department of Defense and the DIA that has this responsibility, to see that they do their job. I mean, we promised the people of this country that this was a high priority, and I think we've got enough evidence that this has not been a very high priority. And I think that we're not in a position to make a judgment of who's alive or who's not alive. I think we have a responsibility to push people who have that capability to make that determination, more importantly, the responsibility to make that determination. Now, that's just my point of view, and I think I want to express that because I think you're dealing here with an oversight committee to make sure that Congress sees that laws we pass and money we appropriate is spent and the job's done the way that the law intends. Admiral, I want to refer to something that Senator Smith has talked to me about because he's been very much involved in reviewing POW returnee briefs, debriefs, and he found at least 3 cases where returnees independently described similar instances in which Vietnamese interrogators threatened to send POWs to something referred to by the Vietnamese as survival camps if they did not cooperate. They were told that if they were sent to these survival camps, they would never return to the United States. Do you have any knowledge of such camps?
I never heard that expression before, but it wasn't uncommon for them to make dire threats of death and so forth. I never heard that expression, but they used to. I can't do anything with that. They okay. Talk about the dark place. I was the one time got on the radio and they said, not radio.
You don't. But you don't have any knowledge of such camps?
No, that's an expression that okay. I would, there could be several like it. But
Admiral, as a prisoner and after your release, did you ever consider the possibility that the Vietnamese might have segregated prisoners soon after capture into 2 separate prison camps? In other words, prison camps where through your communication and your observance of and your keeping track of Americans that maybe if they had a totally separate system, you wouldn't know anything about it?
Well, you were gone when I went through my views on that, and it related to the first man that ever brought that up to me as a question was Elliot Richardson when he's Secretary of Defense.
Okay.
And that took place in February or March 1973. After, I see Elliot ever so often, and we always go over that conversation. I think he thought, and I said that would have been, I listed a whole bunch of factors that would have never let me take that as a serious consideration. I won't give him again now, but I've always had the feeling he probably thought I was right, but I've never heard him say, why don't you ask him sometime? He was the first man to ever ask that question.
But you're convinced that your system was the system, and the communication that you had with your fellow prisoners
there was just nothing in the wind. The motive, the way the Vietnamese thought, I sound like amateur shrink, but you had to be that. That was their plans for the future. They weren't that far seeing. They thought that they weren't dumb. I'm not saying that, but the war had a predictable end. And they would to have kept them afterward for the kinds of goals they might get now was not in the cards. It was if I'm again, it's mathematically possible, and I could be wrong, but if you ask me if I think that was so, I would say I would be very, very surprised if that ever turned up that was right.
Well, then, as a follow-up, isn't it true that your system was unaware of those Laos prisoners that had been held in North Vietnam for years, some in the same prisons as POWs known to the system, and that they were unknown until shortly before homecoming?
Well, what are their names? Do you know their names? That doesn't sound like it.
I think he's referring to the 9.
Yeah.
To the
Okay.
6 or
Well,
9.
those I've got. Let me read you the book on that, because you should have this.
Admiral, I think he's referring to the 9.
Yeah.
Who
Okay.
ultimately
This is a debrief from 3 well-known. This is my sheet in preparation for this. My notes. Ted Guy, I talked about him, shot down March 22nd at a certain ZPU gun position, Route 9 Techapong, Laos. Arrived at the plantation in the North Vietnamese system in 1968, probably because he was captured by North Vietnamese. I never asked him that, but Ernie Brace, I'm going to get to him, he says that was true of all of it. And was moved to Las Vegas in '69. That's a prison section of Wallow. And as a result of COMRAP, was sent to Farnsworth, where he was joined South Vietnamese captives. Now, this is a Laos shoot-down. Within our system, we had 5 of them. After the Son Tay raid, the night of 2021, November 1970, Guy and his South Vietnamese captives were moved into the plantation. I got this on the phone last week. I didn't know where they were kept until 1973. For accountability purposes, he lost to the main body of American POWs in Vietnam from May 70 onwards. Okay, that's not. The other 4 Laos shoot-downs, and that is Brace, Stisher, Bettinger, and Long, that were in that big round, and they were moved out on the night of 7 February. That was a night of something we call a church riot. There was a big riot in our prison, for which I was put in irons for another couple of months. But anyway, they moved them out. There was something, they were nervous about having people shot down in Laos in company with us. I've been told that it's against international law to move prisoners of war across international boundaries. But anyway, all these guys went together out at this place I call it. They all moved, followed the same itinerary. They went as a group to a camp unoccupied at the time, which they called Hideaway, which Ernie Brace, a civilian Air America pilot, after examining photos and after reparation, became convinced was the abandoned briar patch. I'm talking about a man you really should know, Ernie Brace. I'll talk more about him if you want. He's a civilian. He knows he spends all of his time in the Far East. He knows, I talked to him on the phone. He said, I know a lot of very powerful people in Western Laos that I could put him in touch with that know what's going on. And he was a prisoner of the Laotians himself for years. In July '71, I'm getting to it, these four joined Ted Guy at at the plantation. That's Brace, Stisher, Long, and Bettinger. 4 other U.S. Air Force pilots shot down in Laos showed up at the plantation after Guy and company got there. Those are the ones you're talking about. Of these, one, Norbert Gottner, U.S. Air Force, joined the above 4 at the Briar Patch. So this was not, none of these places were places where we had any American prisoners except the people shot down in Laos. And they were all being moved to another prison. So these people never intersected. And, okay, here's their name. Norbert Gottner, U.S. Air Force. Edward W., also known as J.R. Leonard, U.S. Air Force, joined at the plantation. Jack M. Butcher, U.S. Air Force, joined at the plantation. Charles F. Reese, U.S. Air Force, joined the plantation. We had 5 Laos prisoners with us. Nobody but those 5 ever came, of our group of 351, ever came in contact with these 4 until the release.
It seems like that kind of confirms, though, the point that I'm trying to make, that there may have been people there that were not part of your communication system.
Well, yes, I said, we learned that in '71 they started bringing in lots of people we didn't know about, Army and Marine people, ground soldiers, and some helicopter pilots.
But in relation to those...
But there was never any mixing of the two until the whistle blew and we all came home.
But since we knew about Guy and we knew about Long, then if they'd been released, they would have told about the other 5 that we didn't know about.
Yeah, sure, right.
Sure. So we would have known about it.
They never intersected, though, so it seems to me that, there was a separate holding pattern.
Yeah, and they put our Laos people over with them.
What did you say, Senator McCain?
I think it's...
What did you say?
No, hold on one second.
Senator from Iowa.
Let me just say, hold on, because I think it's an important point to try to follow up on. I'm trying to get each answer, because I'd like to make sure the record's clear on it, and we don't have it clear. Iowa asserted that they may have intersected. Now, Admiral, you were about to answer, and then we'll get Senator McCain in on it. What was your answer to that, Senator?
The only people, there were 4 people brought to the plantation in 1971 who none of us knew about, that had been originally captured in Laos.
They were brought in '71.
Yes, and they were brought to there's one extra wrinkle here. I maybe should talk to you later, because one of them joined at a previous camp called Briar Patch, but 3 joined at the plantation. At the same time, on the move, as of February 7th, 1971, were 4, our remaining 4 Laotian shoot-downs. That's Brace, Stisher, Long, and Bettinger. They all wound up at the plantation, and we never saw any of them until the whole bunch was released.
But I think the question the Senator is asking is, did you know of them in the system, Admiral, prior to the release, or did you only learn of them at release?
No, there was we never had an interchange of names between the plantation and that I know of.
So my point was, there is a separate holding pattern.
They started in about '71. Yeah, there were. A new phase started.
It started in '71. Now, Senator McCain, you wanted to...
My point is, since we knew about the 4, Stisher, Long, Bettinger, Guy, that when they had been released, they knew about the other 5 that we didn't know about. So in order for us not to have known about the 5, then Stisher and Long and Bettinger and Guy would have had to have not been released also, who we did know about.
Yeah, right. That's right. There was no way we could have gotten trapped on that. Their names would have gotten home.
Is there any...
Does anybody, on the Laos thing, one of our Laotian shoot-downs wanted to make sure you knew that there were 2 other guys captured in Laos that were joined with us at Operation Homecoming, both civilians, one an American, one Canadian, both chaplains. Their names are Sam Maddox, an American from Centralia, Washington, and Lloyd Opal, O-P-A-L, a Canadian. The two have co-authored a book entitled Captives on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, published by the Moody Bible Press. That's a full book on them. Okay.
I think the point in conclusion for my round of questioning is that if some of those 9 had not been released, we wouldn't have known about any of them, and that's where I rest my case. They never intersected, and thus there's a separate holding pattern.
I think...
Admiral, do you want to address that? What Senator...
Let him.
Okay. You wanted to address that?
I think we could almost do it with a diagram or something. I mean, I can explain it, but I don't know how to...
What Senator is saying is that you didn't learn of these people until you were released.
Right.
So there was some place these people were being held outside of your system.
Right. They were being held in a prison where I didn't take cognizance of any of the people there.
Correct.
Except those I knew before.
The Senator's point, I think, therefore, is if they were able to be held there in another system and you didn't know it, it raises the possibility of other people being held somewhere, particularly as to Laos.
Yeah, okay. And
other people being held somewhere that you wouldn't know of.
But, Mr. Chairman,
but Ted Guy would have known it, and he was officer in charge.
Correct. That's the next point. Now, that's where the Senator is, at which point you come in, and Senator McCain asserts that you close the loop by pointing to the fact that they would have known it. And they didn't.
They would have had to have kept them all back, and we would have raised heck because we knew 5 of them.
Now, let me take the possibilities the one step further. You've answered, and Senator McCain has answered, as to those 5 and 4. But carrying Senator Grassley's question one step further, could there not have been yet another holding point outside of that one which Ted Guy could report for? And I suppose the answer to that would have to be, possibly. We don't have the answer.
I don't claim any ironclad 100% accountability for anybody outside that 351.
Okay, fair enough.
Right.
Could I just interject?
Let no one ever say we weren't neutral here.
May I just ask a question here because it's germane? Does either Senator McCain or Admiral Stockdale know if Ted Guy mentioned David Herdlicka's name? David Herdlicka was a prisoner in Laos?
Yes. I think he knows about him. Everybody does. But he's never said... No, I've talked to him and Brace about how many people we have seen from Laos, and his name didn't come up on either list.
Admiral, just to close the loop, the last piece of that, I imagine that and you've already acknowledged this, you don't know specifically about Laos, but you've been very precise as to Vietnam. You don't believe there was any other pattern in Vietnam.
Very precise about my aircrew prison in Vietnam, North Vietnam.
And the surrounding areas which you were connected to. Now, you drew a distinction a moment ago about Laos capture versus Vietnam capture. If they were captured by the North Vietnamese, they had a better shot. Do you just want to shed light to the committee on that?
Well, we know that it's strange that only 9 military men who are now in freedom that were shot down in Laos. And I asked Brace what they have in common. He said, well, there's only, he laughed at my ignorance. He said, we're all captured by North Vietnamese soldiers, and they brought us to Hanoi. You see, we normally think of the, I mean, it's strange, but I think of the Laotian people as kind of placid peasants, and North Vietnamese soldiers as ferocious. But in this case, the only way you got to freedom was to get captured by the more organized army, which was North Vietnam. And they, for some reason, felt maybe that they brought them home and gave them to their own people. Their own people were a little uncomfortable with them.
And that the Lao didn't.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Senator Grassley, has he completed? Senator Daschle is completed. Senator Reid.
Admiral, you've made very clear that for a pilot to eject and still be alive is not easy.
Not in those circumstances, not at the speeds he's coming out at, not with infectious jungles and hostile civilians on the ground.
You've also indicated that, and we have two men who are living proof of this in this room today, that if you do eject safely, then generally you got hurt after you landed.
Well, I don't know what the statistics are. Probably less. Some few got off scot-free. I mean, sprains and bruises.
Is it fair, Admiral, that most of the people that were in your prison compound who ejected got hurt after they landed on the ground?
I would say more than 50%. Oh, wait a minute. By what? By one force or another? The force of gravity or the force of a machete? Or?
I mean the force of machete.
Oh, well, I think that would be an interesting statistic, and I would think we could, that's something somebody should have busied himself putting down when we came home with all those debriefs.
My point...
I've talked to many people who have a story to tell, but I don't have any idea what the frequency of it is. I mean,
my point, and I think you've made it here today, is that many pilots who were hit in the air ejected, and just the force of gravity, you got hurt. I mean, you and McCain had you had your shoulders broken, you had your back broken, and in addition to that, you and McCain, after you hit the ground, were hurt by the people who captured you.
Right. And many more were. How many more, I don't know.
And that was and that was not unusual for that to take place.
I mean, it's explosive situation. There were people, lots of tales, but we haven't ever collected them.
And while we have no empirical evidence to this fact, it appears that you had a much better chance of surviving if you came down an area that was controlled by North Vietnamese military.
Well, that I don't know. Everything we came down on was North Vietnam. Right, you're right. The very good point. The Army was your salvation.
Military saved your life.
Right.
Somebody tried to shoot you the first night.
Now, you see, I'll tell you why that's probably so. You just can't take the propaganda immersion that a country like that has to put out and then modify it in some way. We were once told, this may be an apocryphal story, but it fit the mood. They said they'd heard where Ho Chi Minh said, when you get these guys, treat them rough, Army. Show the people that you show no mercy to these people, but for God's sake, don't kill them because they're going to be worth their weight in gold someday. If that wasn't the way, what he said, the way they acted was that way, because they would be very brusque, but they would break no bones. The civilian would take out his machete and cut your head off.
And the evidence that we have, and there could be, at this stage, certainly, again, nothing scientific, but the only people that you know of that survived being shot down over Laos were people that were shot down and then captured by North Vietnamese military.
Yes, I just learned that from Brace. That's what he given the names, he said every one of them came out. He said he was, of course.
Which leads to the conclusion, again not scientific, that those people who were not shot down in areas controlled by North Vietnamese military were probably killed in some manner.
Could have been. I've heard tales that I can't verify. You know, I haven't ever...
Point is, you know, I don't know either, but the fact is we have no evidence. If anyone survived that was shot down over Laotian territory not controlled by North Vietnamese, I don't know.
Well, they're certainly not back. Yeah, I don't know. Some took pictures of them in the meantime, I guess.
Would you, just for purposes of me and the record, indicate how you and the other people that were in your prison compound, how you memorize these large numbers of names and other things?
I'll tell you, when you stay in solitary a while, your mind dries out, and you're without sensory perceptions, and your mind acquires powers in other directions. And I'm terrible at memory. I can't even remember where I put my car keys. But when I was in solitary, I could tell you the exact date when I rolled out of bed, how many prisoners we had in that camp. My mind, I worked at it. It was also a hobby, a recreation. But
And you said Rutledge was better than you.
oh yes. But I think it's
Why do you say he was better than you in memorization?
well, I often have to ask him questions, and he always had the answer. But he was more hyper and more on top of it. He would be very quick. He would be very. He'd tell me, you know, I was supposed to have all the wisdom, but he'd say, we got to get these bad names out of this system. I'm going to take over. I got these guys. We're going to have a committee meeting. It's going to last about 10 days, and we're going to shake it down and get these bad names out, and then we're going to see who's here and so forth. That's the kind of a guy he was.
And you, momentarily, when you first started, you started tapping on your microphone. Is that how you communicated in the prison?
That was a poor example of it, but we had a monotone, we had a 5x5 matrix, a 25-letter alphabet, and you represented each letter by 2 beats of 1 or through 5, and a lot. There's an interesting lecture that goes with that, but you can use it. It was better than the Morse code because you don't have to make 2 sounds or make 2 motions, but you can go under a door, and anything you can do with this kind of tapping, you can do with your finger, and you can watch.
After several years of tapping with the same person, it's like the old telegraph operators in the West. You can
they have
talk almost as fast. You can tap almost as fast as you can talk.
Right, and you have and you can identify them, of course, as John said. You'd think a Vietnamese could tap on the wall. They often tried it, but I mean, you stay away from that. That's a gook, kid. No question about it.
Admiral, it's my understanding that yesterday you reviewed a list that Senator Smith gave you of some 324 names. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you review that list yesterday?
Well, I reviewed it only to the extent that I looked at those that were items, and I did it here sitting in here. I may have missed 1 or 2, but items that were supposedly taken out of the debriefs of prisoners that were in my system. And I was alarmed about the fact that 8 of the entries were from the debrief of one James Mulligan. They were names I'd never heard of, so when I went home to lunch, I called Mulligan. I found him down at Kitty Hawk with one of his sons, and I said, and I didn't say, hey, what are you doing? I went at him very easy. I said, listen, Jim, I'm down here getting ready to testify, and I'm looking at a name that you have in your debrief, and could you tell me who the guy is? I don't remember him. And he said, what was he? He said, I never heard of such a person. And we went through all 8, and he said, those are, not one of those was in my name bank. I never heard of them before. And he said another thing, I forbid the committee from looking at my debrief for some reason I never asked him about. But anyway, that's a sample.
How would these names get in his debrief then?
Somebody's made a clerical error, I think. I mean, there's some got the wrong order. There's 2 Mulligans. I never heard the other one, but with James Mulligan, Navy, he's one of my good friends.
And you have no doubt that he was recalling this with a clear memory?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no question. I know him like I know Sybil. I mean, he couldn't lie to me for a minute.
You think the names are in there just simply because of a clerical error?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Senator Reid, would you just yield for me 1 second?
Be happy to.
I just want to say, Admiral, and I respect your answer and I have no reason to doubt it, but I would want to at least have the opportunity to enter into the record the United States government document which does mention those names in regard to Mulligan.
Okay, it was
so that I could put that in
I
there.
don't know. Is that a designation for a debrief or what? I don't know.
I'm sorry?
The document was listed as M hyphen 3 letters. three numbers.
That a debrief document is the question.
Is that a debrief document?
Yeah, it's a number, it's a DIA number that correlates to his debrief.
The question is, was the specific document his debrief, or was it some
Another
other
thing
piece of
I
paper?
noticed on that list that, well, this is not fair, but there was some.
All right, it was the Air Force summary, I am told. It's not.
Okay. Air Force summary.
Go ahead.
I've never seen an Air Force debrief. Have you? I thought they were all on the computer and you couldn't
In
get out.
1978, the Air Force reviewed the debriefs. The Air Force reviewed all the debriefs, and apparently it's in an Air Force summary of the debrief. So as you say, I don't know if it's in the debrief. Do you know if it's actually in the
James
I have
debrief?
not
Mulligan
read
in the
his
Air
debrief.
Force.
It's in the summary of the debriefs.
You wanted to say something else, Admiral?
I want to say something else. Maybe I incorrectly charged you for the responsibility of making determinations after. It seems to me that the Commander-in-Chief has the final responsibility, but maybe one of the things we should look at is who does have the responsibility. I was aghast after Jim was shot down to be told that the Defense Department no longer had responsibility for him, that the State Department had responsibility for him. Now, who does have responsibility, the final responsibility for these people?
Mrs.
For the
Stockdale,
people who are missing, who has that responsibility?
You're raising an excellent question. We discussed this a little bit yesterday. We discussed it on our trip. Obviously, the Commander-in-Chief, as the President and Commander-in-Chief, has final responsibility. But what's interesting about this is that over the years, it became a political football and it's been bounced around. And I think it's probably the judgment of the committee that we're going to look pretty hard at this question of responsibility, because a lot of the designations and categories have shifted. It's created some of the morass that we find ourselves in. And what's very significant is that military people whose conscience on this, I would think, is higher than anybody's. I mean, the whole notion that has been described here by the Admiral of the feelings people had as fellow prisoners for fellow prisoners, the feelings you had for your wingman, the feelings you have as a comrade in arms in a battalion or in a long-range patrol. You don't forget people. I mean, you just don't sort of walk away from it. And I've always felt that that shift of that sort of judgmental part of this away from the military line of authority and line of command is one of the things that's contributed to this problem. So maybe we'll cope with it and make a recommendation, but I think...
You wanted to say something else.
John, Senator McCain asked me if I had another, and I wanted to tell Senator Smith that I put on my tape last night some comments as I went through. There were quite a number of them from people who took early releases. That was against our orders. And one of them I'd come in contact with before, who caused a woman to call me, and this fellow, I thought of all of them as bad names. I can't, they're names that I'd never heard of, but that doesn't, I can't pass judgment on it all the way, but they were kind of clustered in 4 or 5 people that took early releases that I could point out to you, and I think I put that on the tape, and they were trying to assuage their guilt for going home by taking home a bunch of names and compensating for it that way, and they grabbed every name they ever heard of or anybody ever told them, and they had no screening at all. That's probably what happened.
Well, another point I want to make is that I think the United States government should be obliged to obey the same code of conduct they ask their military men to obey. That did not happen, as you know, during this war, and I think that that was totally out of order, totally unfair, and caused a lot of agony. And I think it's completely wrong for the government not to have to obey the same code of conduct during time of war that they ask their military men to obey.
Senator Kerry, can I finish my questions now?
I apologize.
What, I read the excerpt you gave me, Chapter 10, Admiral. What are your feelings about Garwood's testimony?
Well, I haven't seen his testimony. I've just read in the newspaper that
What do
he
you
was
think?
heavily relied on because he had a lot of sightings and everybody believed him. And I don't know the man, but I've written an article for the Washington Post about him when he came out. I can give you the date and time on that. But generally speaking, he was kind of weak. You know, he got in a lot of trouble right after he came out. After I read that chapter and find out that the Marine Corps court-martial found out that he had, first of all, just abandoned his station and taken a Jeep and gone up to where he was either captured or voluntarily went with the VC, immediately became a spokesman for him on the radio, was given a permit that they reproduced in this Marine Corps book to return to the United States, a bill of a release, and he asked instead if he could enlist in the VC Army, was given permission after due consideration, apparently did pretty well. By this time, they say in this court-martial proceeding that he was speaking the language fluently, had assumed a Vietnamese name, applied for a commission in 1968 and was commissioned an officer in the VC, bragged to the prisoners that he guarded, sometimes abused, according to some charges, the American prisoners, that he was not only a combat officer, but that he had been wounded in combat by American military men. And when he came out, in the physical exam, they found that he had gunshot wounds on his body that were not on his body when he left Da Nang, when he took the Jeep and left.
Had you heard of him until you came back?
I think he was on the radio a lot. There were a lot of infamous names, and his was one of them. There was another guy that is also written up in that book. There's a whole bunch of people that we never talk about in this MIA thing that were defectors. McKinley Nolan, it was one. He would be on the radio, Illinois Hannah, every week. There's a dozen or more like that that have never come home, never wanted to come home. They live over there in Asia, and they still look like Americans, and probably get their name taken for a sighting report every few weeks.
My question, though, I guess, is give us your opinion as the credibility of Garwood. Credibility of Garwood.
Well, I thought maybe when I saw him being referred to that you knew that book and you'd looked into it and there was something wrong with the man that wrote the book and the Marine Corps made a horrible error. I have great respect for the Marines and Eddie Simmons in particular, who wrote the foreword, who's the historian of the Marine Corps. And just to read it, and you'd have to trust a man that joined an army to fight his fellow countrymen. I mean, that's a height of unreliability as far as I'm concerned.
One of the witnesses going to testify this afternoon, Collins, states Vietnamese were meticulous record keepers in the finest bureaucratic fashion.
Where'd that come from?
From a statement we're going to have this afternoon.
Oh, well, they certainly scribbled all the time I wrote. I mean, I wondered what they were going to do with it. Sometimes it was just trivia, but they were upwardly mobile, young, illiterate bureaucrats of a sort that we see all around us.
And during the time you were in prison?
This committee accepting. I know.
During the time you were there, you saw them keeping records of what was going on in this
facility?
facility.
Have notepads. They wrote down everything. They wrote down everything.
Did one last question, Mr. Chairman? Actually, two. What knowledge did you have of the Vietnamese language by the time you got out?
Weren't permitted to have any. Once in the hospital before the big siege started, I mean, they were kind of wishy-washy. I was having my leg made an incision in my leg so they could get it under me. I had a kind of a pleasant Vietnamese-speaking, but slight English-speaking doctor who had gone to Sorbonne for his med school, and he would tell me, call me Bakshi, and then he would tell me about different foods. And he wrote that on a box that, I forget, it was there by my bed. And after about 3 days in the hospital, they took me back. I took that box with me, and the camp went bananas when they saw all this. They considered it a secret language. were not to know it. And you can see why the practicality factor increased greatly with that, because you'd be in a room and you would be being, you know, put through the ropes, say, tortured, and they could talk freely back and forth. Shall we try this guy one more time, or whatever they were saying? If somebody had, and a lot of American servicemen were educated in the Vietnamese language, none of them, very few of them pilots, but if a guy had known the Vietnamese language and he had landed in there in a parachute and been captured, and had the sense and the modesty to keep it quiet, he would have had a gold mine, because they just assumed you had no. They didn't want any of their language to be known.
So even though they didn't want you to learn it, you still had no opportunity to learn it, huh?
No. Well, I know 5 words maybe. I forget them now.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Stockdale, Mrs. Stockdale, this has been some of the most moving and I think helpful testimony this committee's had over the course of the year. And, I want to add my thanks to you for not only your enormous service to our country, but for your help with our task. Your testimony brings back a flood of memories, I think, for all of us, of political leaders that I believe deserted our men in the field, of incredible heroics on the part of those who served in a war that did not have the complete commitment by some of our leaders. Mrs. Stockdale, you mentioned having the government comply with the same code of conduct that we ask the men who served our country, men and women who served our country in Vietnam, to comply with. Help me with that. What specific leaders and conduct are you referring to?
Well, as I understand it, the code of conduct disallows parole. That is, you can't come home early. And not only did and some men did come home early. As I said, they made a deal and came home early. And the government, instead of complying with the code of conduct and recognizing what these men had done as far as parole, they honored them. They paraded them around. They brought them to meetings and they took them aboard ships and honored them in front of the other military men. I think that was a violation of the code of conduct on the part of the United States government. They never told the statute of limitations, so that when the collaborators came home, because the government had not told the statute of limitations, the collaborators could not be prosecuted by the government. Yeah, when the rest of them, when the rest of the men came home. Those are the sorts of those are 2 examples that come to my mind right away.
Mm-hmm. In my own mind, the conduct of the vast majority of the Americans who served as POWs was a dramatic contrast to some of the things we had happen in Korea, where we first ran into psychological warfare, in effect, an effort to propagandize POWs. And Admiral, your conduct, along with others, I think, is a great beacon of heroics for how an American ought to behave under those circumstances. And I'm sure every member of this committee joins me in our salute to you for the way you conducted yourself. We've heard some testimony over the year with regard to special focus the North Vietnamese or the Soviets might have had towards pilots and radar intercept operators for the F-111As. The focus being that the F-111A may have included machinery, equipment, technology that the Soviets did not have at the time, and that might be a partial explanation of why so few F-111A operators came home or repatriated. Do you have any light you can shed on that phenomenon for us? Did you hear anything?
I don't think in the Hanoi prison. I could look it up here in a minute if you want me to. I don't know if we had any F-111 guys in prison. I could tell in a minute. Let me see. You see, that airplane wasn't, there were really 2 air wars, and they were 3.5 years apart. As long as we were in World War II, we sat there with nothing going on while we got ready for the next war. Let me glance and see if we got anybody in an F-111.
Oh, we didn't come back early? What's Stockdale said? Just tells you the problem. See, here's the document that we use, the headquarters. And here's the summary of all non-returnees reported. Here are your returnees, non-returnees reported, and the candidate DI identifier. Here's the returnee, Mulligan. That's the guy who was telling me about that he called. Mulligan. It was. Second-hand information. And I believe the guy.
Okay, I've got 2. Is that all we got? Okay, they're at the end of the alphabet. I skimmed it, and we got 2 guys that you could easily contact them. Spoony Barger.
Admiral, could you pull the mic again?
Yeah, we had 2 people in. Well, now Spoony Barger was never in our camp system. So I mean, he came home, but he didn't come home via my prison. Spoony Barger, S-P-O-N-E-Y-B-A-R-G-E-R, Robert D. returned on March 73, and he's shown as a pilot of an F-111, and I don't know where he was held. And Wilson, I've gone over this pretty fast, but I may have missed one, but I don't think so. Wilson, he also was not in our prison system, but he was returned. He was in an F-111, shot down 22 December. You know, these. So I don't have no knowledge of anybody. I never had anybody in my prison that had flown an F-111. So I don't know.
I assume that could imply that they had received separate treatment, although obviously it's not conclusive.
Well, we could run those 2 cases down. That'd be interesting.
Right now, as we had left discussions in Hanoi, there are 3 things going ahead. One, an effort to recover photos and artifacts that have not yet been turned over, and apparently there's substantial amounts of both. And a scouring of the provincial museums, which may well shed light on those who did not make it to the main prison system. An effort by our military to follow up on live sighting reports that is still underway. We've had a lot of progress there, but that's not completed, and there's some additional ones that are still going on. And an intriguing effort, I think, to interview North Vietnamese military personnel that were in command or at the locations at the times that pilots and flight crews were shot down. Those 3 things, I think, are going to go ahead. Are there any other tasks that you think would be particularly helpful that we should be focusing on completing in our effort to identify the fates of Americans?
I don't.
Well, I think you should get some of these people in here who know, obviously, there are a lot of people out there who know a lot about a lot of the areas, May Rose Evans Humphreys being an example of one. I think that you need to hear from those people.
Well, that
With respect to, we need to hear from them with respect to.
With respect to more information about Laos. I mean, that's the area that I don't think that it's been. If you haven't talked to May Rose, then you don't have the full story. I don't think. I think you need to talk to her. Plus, there may be others.
she lives in Alameda, California.
Would you be willing to submit to Senator Brown and the committee any other people that you think are key to this?
I think I've been this fellow Brace. You should know him, and I'd like to know how to get him into the system. He's very.
We've interviewed Brace.
Huh?
We have interviewed Brace.
You've interviewed Brace?
Is that correct?
He was complaining that he's been ignored.
He has not been interviewed yet. We are aware of him.
Okay.
There's still contact.
This is there's a couple of there's a Congressional Medal of Honor winner who's
on the list.
A special agent. He was he won his medal as a SEAL team guy in the DMZ. Now, he doesn't offer, but he called me up especially. He and his buddy, both 25-year FBI investigators. They're out in Idaho now, but they wanted to know if they could be of any help in an investigation. And that, I mean, they're both gung-ho guys. I don't know whether that's all I know.
We'll have them.
Mr. Chairman, one last question. Admiral, last spring, late spring, when this committee went to Southeast Asia, among the visits at that time was in Laos. And strangely, or perhaps not strangely at all, the people who run that government there are primarily the same ones who were active in the path at Laos during the time of the war. They're not much new blood. Basically the same leadership that was, at least my impression, were installed by the North Vietnamese. We had very frank discussions with them and pushed them very hard on what happened to our aviators. And finally, at one point, with the Deputy Foreign Minister, we simply said flatly, look, we know there were a large number of American aviators shot down over your region of Laos. We know that a significant number of them were alive when they hit ground. We have reason to believe a significant number of them were alive when your forces took them into custody. We have no accounting for them. What happened to them? And after some pressure, government spokesman simply said, look, we didn't appreciate at the time how important this question would be, and some of them were killed. How do you evaluate that? How do you...
Well, I don't know. I've never dealt with a Laotian, but that may be an answer to the $64 question. I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Admiral, I want to again thank you for your help, and also for an example I think that every American can be proud of what an American serviceman can do and how he can serve his country through an extraordinary means. There are lots of medals given out in the modern military, but the ones you wear, I think, are as well earned as any Americans ever had.
Thank you, sir. I want to reply by injecting my views on the matter of contrasting my performance with the Korean War people. We've all read, I came up in that vintage of reading Every War But One and so forth, and I had that. Since then, I've gotten to know, and there were some cases of, there you had very young soldiers, 18 years old, 17 in some cases, fighting in snow, with no preparation at all, in the way of survival schools and things we do now. And so there were some things that rightly needed correcting, and President Eisenhower wrote the code of conduct for that reason. But after knowing several people who were prisoners of the Koreans who did first-class work, every bit as good as we did, I always want to, I think they kind of take a bum rap. I'm thinking of Major Roy Gray, who was the test pilot with me. I could name others who were just as tough and just as diligent. And so we all, Americans always, everybody does, they kind of like to color everything the same color, but there were plenty of good men there, and plenty of them just as good as I was, and I didn't want to give them a black eye, so thank you.
Thank you. Are you back, Mr. Chairman?
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. Admiral, as we conclude this panel, I join all my colleagues in expressing our gratitude to you today, to both of you. Thank you for the testimony. Thank you, obviously, for coming back and going through something that brings back a lot of rawness, I'm sure. Everybody has said it from sort of my opening throughout, that there really aren't ways to adequately express gratitude for what you all went through. I think for those of us who were over there, who were shot at and saw a lot of the war, but weren't captured, there was always that horrible fear that you might be. I think the two fears you had were, apart from being killed, were being maimed and being captured. And I know that there just isn't any way to describe what it's like to be alone and lonely and beaten and tortured and never knowing when you're coming back, or if, never knowing what the next day will bring, and having that loss of personal freedom that we value so highly in this country. So we do salute you, we thank you, and wish you Godspeed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all very much.
Vice Chairman.
Before you leave, Admiral, I just want to and appreciate, maybe you could intercede for me to help me out, and the staff is trying to get a copy of the document for you so that I can put it in front of you, because your comments regarding Mulligan really are of interest to me because of the fact that this document does exist. And as soon as it comes here, I'll show it to you. But this is a summary document, and what I will explain it briefly. What they did was they gleaned through the entire all of the debriefs, just the Air Force, and took, and there'll be I'm bringing a copy up to you, and these were the returnees. And if you look at the cover sheet, it says U.S. Air Force Data Services Center, and then you go to the first page at the top. It says homecoming egress, summary of all non-returnees reported, and the candidate identifier. Now, Mulligan, you see his name on the right?
You want the second page, I think.
In the second page, see Mulligan's name on the right?
I see James
and then
Mulligan.
If you go across from right to left, you'll see in the case of this individual's name, I prefer not to mention the name there, but on the left-hand side of the person he identified, but hearsay secondhand prison. That means that Mulligan, according to this document, Mulligan allegedly said in his debrief that he had secondhand information, hearsay information, that the guy on the left was alive. Now, let me move to the last page, because there are 3 or 4 of them there that regard hearsay. But this is the one that I wanted to ask you about. Mulligan, again, this is page number 33 on the list there. You see it on the last page? Mulligan, James A.
No, it's warm, they have no shirt.
First-hand contact by tap code.
Yeah, I saw that. And I asked him about Collimore, and he said never heard of him.
So just for the record, now this is very interesting.
Oh, yeah. I think you got... I mean, here... You didn't misquote this document.
I know it. I mean, I'm really grateful that you brought this up, because this is something we have to deal with. But I just want to explain for the public here. Here's a man named Mulligan who returned. He says he contacted Alan P. Cullimore by tap code, by the code that you so skillfully, you explained so and how elaborate it was. He says he contacted this guy by tap code. Cullimore never returned. Now, in your conversation with Mr. Mulligan, he says he didn't. Now, he may have forgotten. It's certainly possible. But the point is, we have a document that says.
I think the document's wrong.
Well, if the document's wrong, then there's. But this is a very serious matter because the public statements by our government are that and you said them yourself, every POW that was alive in the system that you guys had contact with, either died or came home, based on your knowledge. Now, this is an exception if, in fact, Cullimore was contacted by Mr. Mulligan. So I might just ask you to run that one back by Mulligan, if you would, or we can, because...
Why don't you call him? Because,
we'll call him.
You know, on that, I think they kept my program last night.
Keep the mic, if you would.
I think last night the attorneys kept... They said, let us take your copy of that. And I think I had Mulligan's home and business phone on the top.
And I want to also say that I did not read Mulligan's debrief at his request. I didn't read it. But
yeah.
But I would like to, because even though the government is not providing them...
Well, you guys would get along fine. Call him up and talk it over. I mean, you're two of the same kind of guys. I mean, something has gotten crosswise here.
But this shows you what we deal with here on the committee.
Yeah, what's the Air Force doing reading Navy debriefs anyway? Why did who chose the Air Force to do this?
I never understood what the Air Force was doing ever. But no.
Pardon? I mean, I just...
well, they did all the debriefs.
Well, the minute you tell me that, I become suspicious.
Well, no, but don't be. They were the principal debrief.
I know they were. I know they were.
I would like to enter just these pages in the record at this point, Mr. Chairman,
Absolutely.
just for clarification.
Those will be made part of the record, and we will follow up with both Jim Mulligan and also with the other folks. It's good stuff to follow up.
Thank you, Admiral. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Admiral. What we're going to do, folks, is in deference to our court reporter and the shifting of the panel, we're going to take a 10-minute recess, but no longer than 10 minutes. So we stand recess for 10 minutes.
As the committee now takes a break in its hearing, we will pause for a brief schedule update. We'll resume our coverage in just a moment.
Go to the left. Go to the home. Make a left.